Welcome, dear listener, to the Rainy Night Storyteller, where every drop of rain carries a tale, and every tale carries you to another world. Tonight, under the soothing rhythm of falling rain, we delve into the enigmatic and haunting story of the magician by Somerset Maugham. Settle into the comfort of this stormy night as we explore the shadows of human desire, power, and mysticism. Let the rain be your companion as the story unfolds, weaving a spell of suspense and intrigue. And now, let us begin. Chapter 1. Paris, autumn of 1898. Night descended, draping the city in a heavy, leaden cloak. The rain-slicked cobblestone streets reflected the wan yellow glow of gas lamps, creating shimmering pools of light that seemed almost spectral. In a ramshackle attic apartment in Montmartre, a haven for struggling artists and dreamers, a small group of young friends were gathered for supper. Laughter echoed through the room, yet an undercurrent of unease lingered in the air. Margaret Dauncey, with her delicate beauty and deep blue eyes, sat beside Arthur Burdon, a young doctor full of earnest enthusiasm. They were the heart of the group, their love a warm flame against the chill of the world. Joining them were Susie Boyd, a vivacious American with fiery red hair, and Henry Welcome, a talented painter perpetually shrouded in melancholy. That evening, the conversation turned to the realm of the uncanny, of supernatural phenomena. Henry, in his low, resonant voice, recounted ancient legends, tales of dark magic. Margaret, though a little frightened, couldn't suppress her curiosity. Arthur, ever the man of science, attempted to debunk each story, yet a flicker of doubt lingered in his eyes. Just then, the door swung open. A tall, imposing figure entered. It was Oliver Haddo. Haddo's arrival was like a sudden gust of cold air in the warm room. An abrupt silence fell, all eyes drawn to him. He possessed a striking, almost unsettling presence, both compelling and disturbing. His face was angular. His deep-set black eyes, like twin abysses, held an unfathomable power. He wore a long black coat that concealed his form, revealing only his gaunt hands, the fingers long and slender, like those of a concert pianist. Haddo remained silent, simply standing there, his gaze sweeping over each person with a chilling intensity. The atmosphere in the room grew thick with tension. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. She felt as if she was in the presence of something beyond human comprehension. Finally, Haddo spoke. His voice was deep and resonant, possessing a strange timbre as if echoing from another world. He spoke of magic, of the mysteries of the universe, of the latent power within each individual. His words were both mesmerizing and terrifying, inspiring both fascination and dread. Arthur, driven by his skeptical nature, challenged Haddo on his pronouncements. Haddo merely offered a faint, chillingly enigmatic smile. He did not directly answer, but simply stated, "Science is but a sliver of the truth. There are far more things than man has yet conceived." Then, Haddo looked directly at Margaret, his gaze seeming to pierce her very soul. "Miss Dauncey," he said, "you possess a sensitive spirit. You have the capacity to perceive what others cannot." A cold dread washed over Margaret. She didn't understand Haddo's meaning, but she knew that his arrival portended something dark and ominous. That night, after Haddo had departed, no one could sleep soundly. The darkness seemed heavier, the smallest sounds amplified into unsettling disturbances. In each mind, the image of Oliver Haddo and his cryptic words lingered. A sense of unease, a premonition of impending doom, hung over them all. Chapter 2. Margaret Dauncey shared a flat near the Boulevard du Montparnasse with Susie Boyd. It was there that Arthur Burdon was expected for tea. The young women waited in the studio, the air thick with the scent of turpentine and the faint, sweet aroma of petit fours arranged meticulously on a model stand. Susie, having heard much of Arthur, anticipated the meeting with a quiet intensity. She knew their connection was steeped in a peculiar kind of romance, one born of circumstance and deep-seated obligation. For years, Susie had endured the stifling monotony of a ladies' school, resigned to a life of quiet desperation. A sudden inheritance had granted her a modest independence, liberating her from that dreary existence. When Margaret, a former pupil, announced her Parisian aspirations, Susie readily agreed to accompany her. At Colorossi's academy, Susie diligently pursued her art, not with delusions of grandeur, but as a form of quiet rebellion against her past. She relished the subtle thrill of her slightly wicked environment, finding solace in observing the lives swirling around her. She held a deep affection for Margaret, and though her own youthful enthusiasms had long faded, she found vicarious joy in Margaret's vibrant appreciation for beauty. Susie, plain herself, harbored no envy, taking genuine pleasure in Margaret's radiant loveliness. She felt a maternal pride in watching Margaret blossom. However, her pragmatic nature compelled her to temper the extravagant praise showered upon Margaret by admirers at the drawing class. She envisioned handing Margaret over to Arthur Burdon, a woman whose character she'd helped shape, whose beauty she'd nurtured with care. Susie knew of Arthur's ardent devotion to Margaret, gleaned from snippets of letters and shared conversations. She was touched by Margaret's reciprocal affection, a blend of love and deep gratitude. The story of their relationship held a unique poignancy. Margaret, daughter of a deceased country barrister, had been taken in by Arthur after her father's death. He had become her guardian, ensuring her well-being and education. When Margaret expressed her desire to study art in Paris, he readily agreed, arranging for her to live with Susie. The revelation of Margaret's financial dependence on Arthur had been a dramatic turning point. The awkwardness of the confession, Arthur's embarrassed insistence that it was a pleasure, had only deepened Margaret's sense of obligation. It added a layer of complexity to their love, a shadow of indebtedness that Susie couldn't quite ignore. Susie had never met Arthur, relying on Margaret's descriptions and portraits that, according to Margaret, failed to capture his essence. "He's not handsome," Margaret had said, "but he's very paintable." Susie had found this a curious, almost unsettling description. Susie privately believed Margaret's artistic passion was a fleeting phase, destined to fade with marriage and domesticity. While she acknowledged Margaret's talent, she also suspected that the enthusiastic praise from her instructors might be influenced by her beauty. As they waited, a subtle tension filled the studio. Susie, though outwardly cheerful, felt a growing unease. She had a strange premonition, a sense that this meeting held more than just a pleasant social exchange. A knock sounded, and Arthur entered. "This is the Fairy Prince," Margaret announced, beaming as she introduced him. "I'm glad to finally meet the woman who has done so much for Margaret," Arthur said, his eyes lingering perhaps a moment too long on Margaret before acknowledging Susie. Susie noted a certain detachment in his gaze, as if his world revolved solely around Margaret. This intense focus, while understandable, made Susie slightly uncomfortable. As Margaret prepared tea, Arthur's eyes followed her every move with an almost unsettling devotion. It was a gaze filled with tenderness, but also with a hint of something deeper, something bordering on obsession. Their eyes met, and a palpable silence hung in the air, a silent conversation passing between them that excluded Susie. "Don't be a pair of perfect idiots," Susie interjected, breaking the spell. The lovers laughed, a faint blush rising on their cheeks. Arthur, as if suddenly remembering his social obligations, turned to Susie. "Margaret tells me you're a talented artist," he said, his tone polite but perfunctory. "She draws delightful caricatures," Margaret added, a playful glint in her eyes. "She's probably sketching a grotesque version of you right now." Susie, though amused, couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur was a man of hidden depths. His face, while not conventionally handsome, held a powerful magnetism. His tall, lean frame exuded a quiet strength, but his dark eyes hinted at a capacity for profound suffering. There was a nervous intensity about him, a sense that he was a man capable of both great love and great pain. As Margaret served tea, her every gesture radiating love and devotion, Susie felt a pang of loneliness. She recognized the depth of their connection, the almost symbiotic bond they shared. It was a love she had never experienced, a love that seemed to exclude the rest of the world. As the evening progressed, Susie found herself drawn into their conversation, her initial unease gradually fading. Yet, a nagging feeling persisted. She observed Arthur's almost desperate need for Margaret's affection, the way his eyes followed her with an almost pleading intensity. It was as if his happiness depended entirely on her. As Arthur prepared to leave, Susie's earlier premonition returned, stronger than ever. She felt compelled to warn Margaret, to express the unease that lingered in her heart. After Arthur's departure, Susie turned to Margaret, her expression grave. "I think he has an extraordinarily good face," she began, her voice measured. "But I've never seen a man with such a capacity for wretchedness. Be very careful, Margaret. Be very good to him. You have the power to make him happier than anyone, but also more unhappy." Margaret, confused by Susie's intensity, could only stare at her in silence. "I don't think you can conceive how desperately he might suffer," Susie continued, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret, her eyes filling with tears, could only reiterate her love for Arthur, her desire for his happiness. Susie, with a forced laugh, embraced her friend, dismissing her own anxieties as mere foolishness. But the seed of doubt had been planted, a subtle hint of the darkness that lay beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic love. Chapter 3. The Chien Noir, a haven for Susie Boyd and Margaret, was a study in contrasts. Downstairs, boisterous crowds devoured affordable, party fare, drawn by the jovial, loud-voiced proprietor. Upstairs, a smaller, horseshoe-shaped room catered to a select group of artists, English, American, and a few French, and their companions, whose relationships, though often outside formal marriage, carried a distinct air of domesticity. Susie, ever the pragmatist, had long ago abandoned Notting Hill's rigid conventions for the more bohemian atmosphere of Montparnasse. The room buzzed with lively conversation, a heated debate on the merits of the later Impressionists raging in rapid French. Arthur, arriving slightly late, found a place reserved between Margaret and Susie. He was quickly introduced to Jagson, a lanky, ethereal youth resembling a dreadfully smudged Aubrey Beardsley. As Susie whispered, possessing more virtue and industry than discernible talent. "It's a local convention," Susie explained to Arthur, "that no one here has any talent. We tolerate each other, but harbor no illusions." She then proceeded to introduce the other patrons. Warren, a perpetually inebriated but genuinely kind painter with a preternatural gift for color. O'Brien, a bitter, failed artist consumed by envy. Madame Rouge's mother, a dignified woman unfazed by her daughter's unconventional relationship, and the elegantly flamboyant landscape painter, Meyer, accompanied by his adoring companion. Raggles, the dandy, and Clayson, the witty sculptor, completed the eclectic group. As Susie began dissecting Clayson's character, the door burst open, and Oliver Haddo made his dramatic entrance. His flamboyant gestures and theatrical pronouncements immediately commanded attention. "Marie, disembarrass me of this coat of frieze. Hang my sombrero upon a convenient peg," he boomed in fractured French, eliciting laughter. Arthur, recognizing him, leaned towards Dr. Porhoët, who sat quietly observing the scene. "Isn't that your magician?" "Oliver Haddo," Porhoët confirmed with a wry smile. Haddo, basking in the attention, struck a commanding pose, reminiscent of Velázquez's Del Borro, a contemptuous smile playing on his lips. He greeted Porhoët with mock reverence, then turned his barbs on Warren, Clayson, Jagson, and Meyer, each insult delivered with theatrical flair and biting wit. The atmosphere shifted. The earlier joviality was replaced by a palpable tension, a sense of unease that hung heavy in the air. The French contingent, along with Warren, O'Brien, Raggles, and Jagson, quickly departed, leaving only Margaret, Arthur, Susie, Porhoët, and Haddo. Haddo, unfazed by the exodus, launched into a series of outlandish pronouncements, claiming to be a renowned lion hunter, a descendant of noble lineage, and a master of arcane knowledge. He recounted a fabricated tale of killing 3 lions with 3 shots, his delivery so grandiloquent that Arthur was certain it was a complete fabrication. "You suffer from no false modesty," Arthur remarked dryly. False modesty is a sign of ill breeding, Haddo retorted, his eyes fixed on Arthur with an unnerving intensity. The conversation veered into the realm of the occult, with Haddo speaking of elemental spirits and the powers of the adept. Porhoët offered a scholarly explanation of medieval beliefs in sylphs, gnomes, undines, and salamanders, adding an air of unsettling plausibility to Haddo's pronouncements. Arthur, increasingly exasperated, challenged Haddo's claims, arguing that they contradicted all scientific understanding. For a scientific man, you argue with singular fatuity, Haddo retorted icily. He then launched into a passionate defense of magic, describing it as the art of employing consciously invisible means to produce visible effects. His tone shifted, the theatricality fading, replaced by a raw intensity. What should you know of that lust for great secrets which consumes me to the bottom of my soul? Susie, intrigued despite herself, attempted to lighten the mood, but Haddo's intensity remained. He declared himself the brother of the shadow, further fueling the sense of unease. Arthur, dismissing Haddo's pronouncements with a sarcastic remark about his weight, inadvertently struck a nerve. Haddo's face flushed with anger, his pale blue eyes turning cold and hard. Susie, sensing a dangerous escalation, quickly intervened, suggesting they leave for the fair. As they departed, the lingering tension remained. Haddo's presence had cast a shadow over the evening, a shadow that hinted at something darker and more sinister than mere eccentricity. The encounter had not only revealed Haddo's flamboyant personality, but also hinted at a deeper, more troubling aspect of his character, a lust for power and a capacity for intense emotion that made him a figure of both fascination and dread. Chapter 4. The bustling street outside the Chien Noir, alive with the clang of trams and the surging crowd, contrasted sharply with the unsettling scene they had just left. As they headed towards the Lion de Belfort Fair, Arthur hailed a cab. Susie, watching Haddo as he placed his hand on the horse's neck, noticed an immediate and violent tremor seize the animal. It shook uncontrollably, gripped by a sudden, inexplicable terror. The coachman, alarmed, rushed to the horse's head, while Margaret and Susie disembarked, witnessing the distressing spectacle. A chilling thought struck Susie. "Take your hand away, Mr. Haddo," she commanded sharply. Haddo, a faint smile playing on his lips, complied. Instantly, the horse's trembling subsided, leaving it shaken but otherwise unharmed. "I wonder what the deuce was the matter with it," Arthur muttered, perplexed. Haddo, his pale blue eyes piercing, as if seeing through them, simply tipped his hat and walked away, leaving a lingering unease in his wake. Susie, turning to Dr. Porhoët, voiced her suspicions. "Do you think he could have caused that?" It happened the moment he touched the horse and stopped as soon as he removed his hand. Arthur scoffed at the idea, but Porhoët's response added another layer of disquiet. He recounted a previous encounter with Haddo, during which his normally placid Persian cats had been seized by a sudden, uncontrollable terror upon Haddo's arrival. Margaret, visibly shaken, expressed her deep aversion to Haddo. "I've never met a man who filled me with such loathing," she confessed, trembling. "I feel his eyes on me even now. I hope I never see him again." Arthur, dismissing their fears as fanciful, vowed to write to Frank Hurrell, a former acquaintance from Oxford, to inquire about Haddo's background. Susie, however, found Haddo intensely intriguing, fascinated by encountering a man who genuinely seemed to believe in the occult. Porhoët, adding to the growing sense of mystery, described Haddo as the most extraordinary individual he had ever met. He emphasized the impossibility of discerning Haddo's true beliefs, questioning whether he was an impostor, a madman, or simply toying with those around him. He also mentioned Haddo's extensive travels, linguistic abilities, and deep knowledge of alchemical literature. "It would not surprise me," Porhoët confessed, "to learn that he possessed powers by which he was able to do things seemingly miraculous." Their conversation was cut short by their arrival at the fair. The Lion de Belfort was a cacophony of sights and sounds. Steam bands blared, merry-go-rounds whirled, and barkers clamored for attention. The lurid glow of acetylene torches illuminated the throng, a mass of people desperately seeking amusement. As they entered, Haddo reappeared, seemingly oblivious to their lack of enthusiasm for his company. His dramatic attire, a Spanish capa with a vibrant red and green lining, and imposing presence drew attention, which he clearly relished. After briefly observing the various attractions, they stopped at a silhouette cutter. Haddo insisted on posing, drawing a crowd that made no attempt to conceal their amusement. Margaret, uncomfortable with the spectacle, wished to leave, but Susie, captivated by Haddo's outlandish behavior, insisted on staying. The silhouette completed, Haddo presented it to Margaret with a theatrical flourish. They continued through the fair, eventually arriving at a tent displaying an Eastern name and a crudely painted image of an Arab snake charmer. Haddo, intrigued, purchased tickets for the group. Inside the dimly lit tent, the air thick with the pungent aroma of incense and decay, a veiled woman sat motionless, rhythmically rubbing a drum. Muhammad, the snake charmer, greeted them with a wide grin, boasting of having performed for Lord Kitchener. He produced a goatskin sack, from which he extracted a long, writhing snake. With a swift movement, he rendered the creature rigid, then played a haunting tune on a reed instrument, causing the snake to come to life, swaying hypnotically. Haddo, visibly captivated, leaned forward, his pale eyes fixed on the charmer with an intense, almost unsettling gaze. Arthur, attempting to reassure a frightened Margaret, explained that the snakes were likely defanged. Haddo countered with a chilling tale of a Madras snake charmer who had died after being bitten by a cobra, suggesting that true snake charming involved a natural immunity to venom. He then spoke to Muhammad in Arabic before turning back to Arthur. He stated that the man possessed a horned viper, known as Cleopatra's asp, the most venomous of Egyptian snakes. Haddo then knelt before the snake, uttering an incantation in Arabic, which Porhoët translated, "O viper, I adjure you, by the great God who is all-powerful, to come forth. Obey my call and come." A horned viper emerged from the back. Haddo seized the snake, opened its mouth, and allowed it to bite his hand. He showed no sign of pain as the snake's teeth sank into his flesh. After reciting another phrase in Arabic, he released the snake. Blood flowed freely from the wound, but Haddo spat on it 3 times, muttered some words, and rubbed the wound. The bleeding stopped instantly. "That surely is what a surgeon would call healing by first intention," he declared, offering his hand for Arthur's inspection. Arthur, though astonished, remained skeptical, demanding proof that the snake was indeed poisonous. Haddo, with a chilling smile, produced a white rabbit. He placed it before the viper, which struck with lightning speed. The rabbit shuddered and died instantly. Margaret cried out in horror, disgusted by the cruel display. "Are you convinced now?" Haddo asked coolly. The 2 women, deeply disturbed, hurried out of the tent, leaving Haddo alone with the snake charmer, the chilling demonstration of his apparent power hanging heavy in the air. Chapter 5. Whispers from the Past. Dr. Porhoët had invited Arthur, Margaret, and Susie to his apartment on the Isle St. Louis for Sunday. The lovers planned a preliminary visit to the Louvre, while Susie, seeking solitude for reflection, opted to explore the city independently. Seeking refuge from the holiday crowds, Margaret and Arthur ventured into the museum's halls of ancient sculpture. The quiet grandeur of the space, filled with timeless works of art, filled Margaret with a profound, if inarticulable, exhilaration. Arthur, his practical nature unmoved by abstract notions of beauty, sought to connect with Margaret's enthusiasm, admiring the anatomical precision of Greek statues with the detached eye of a surgeon. However, one piece, the graceful Diane de Gaby's, held a particular fascination for him. He insisted on revisiting it, a fact that both amused and pleased Margaret, who knew his attraction stemmed from a perceived resemblance to herself. The statue, displayed alongside the mocking faun and the sightless Homer, depicted Diana not as a powerful huntress or cold celestial being, but as a young girl fastening her cloak. There was a delicate, almost vulnerable quality to her, a sense of nascent womanhood. To Arthur, Margaret embodied this same exquisite grace, unconscious composure, and ineffable purity. The statue's features mirrored Margaret's own: the delicate ears, the finely chiseled features, the tender skin that evoked images of sunsets, night skies, roses, and deep water. As Arthur gazed at the statue, his eyes filled with tears. "I wish you weren't so beautiful," he confessed awkwardly, revealing a rare vulnerability. "I'm so afraid something will happen to prevent our happiness." Margaret, understanding the depth of this confession from such a practical man, took his hand. Arthur, attempting to regain his composure, spoke almost to himself, voicing a superstitious fear of tempting fate. "Whenever I've really wanted anything, I've managed to get it. I don't see why things should go against me now." He straightened his back, dismissing his own morbid thoughts. Meanwhile, Susie wandered through the heart of her beloved Paris, the Isle St. Louis. Its narrow streets, lined with quaint shops, and its tranquil atmosphere offered a stark contrast to the bustling boulevards. The names of the streets echoed a bygone monarchy, and even the plain trees seemed imbued with a unique sobriety. Susie, captivated by the island's charm, felt a pang of regret as she turned towards Dr. Porhowitt's residence. She ascended a dark, broad staircase and rang the bell at his door. Dr. Porhowitt greeted her personally, informing her that Margaret and Arthur had already arrived. He led her through a formal dining room into his library, a room overflowing with books, stacked on the floor, piled on chairs, lining every wall. Susie, delighted by the sight, exclaimed, "Now you mustn't talk to me. I want to look at all your books." Dr. Porhowitt, equally pleased, offered cigarettes and gestured towards his collection. The books, a mix of ancient tomes in calfskin and pigskin bindings and more recent paperbacks, were arranged without any discernible order. The air was thick with the musty scent of aged paper and leather. Among his books, Dr. Porhowitt seemed transformed, retaining his affability but displaying a newfound brusqueness. He showed Susie a rare Quran, a gift from a patient in Alexandria, then turned to the subject of the occult. "I venture to think that no private library contains so complete a collection," he said, gesturing towards a section of shelves. "But I dare not show it to you in the presence of our friend Arthur. He is too polite to accuse me of foolishness, but his sarcastic smile would betray him." Susie, with a thrill of anticipation, examined the titles, feeling as though she were entering a realm of forgotten lore. Dr. Porhowitt pointed out several key works: books by Paracelsus, the Grimoire of Honorius, works by Torquemada, Delancre, Del Rio, Wyrus, Haber, and the infamous Malleus Maleficarum. He then displayed a particularly treasured volume, the Clavicula Salomonis, claiming it had once belonged to Casanova. He then introduced the Kabbalah, recounting its mythical origins with Moses and its subsequent transmission through generations. He then debunked the traditional story of the Zohar's authorship, revealing its more recent origins. Arthur, amused by Porhowitt's blend of scholarly presentation and ironic detachment, remarked, "I never know how much you really believe of all these things you tell us." "My dear friend, I never know myself how much I believe," Porhowitt replied. "I wonder if it is for the same reason that Mr. Haddo puzzles us so much," Susie mused. "Ah, there you have a case that is really interesting," Porhowitt agreed. He confessed his inability to determine whether Haddo was a charlatan or genuinely believed in his claimed powers. Susie recounted the strange events of the previous night: the horses trembling, the viper's deadly bite, and Haddo's apparent immunity. Arthur, while unable to explain these events, remained skeptical. Margaret, however, expressed a deep sense of unease, haunted by Haddo's image and words. Arthur, reassuring her, mentioned his letter to Frank Hurrell. Susie, however, declared her intention to invite Haddo to tea. At that very moment, Haddo's voice boomed from the doorway. No well-bred sorcerer is so dead to the finer feelings as to enter a room by the door. The unexpected arrival startled everyone. Haddo, with his characteristic blend of pomposity and humor, explained his dramatic entrance. The conversation turned back to the occult, with Dr. Porhowitt sharing a personal experience with a magic mirror in Alexandria. a story that even Arthur found difficult to dismiss. Haddo then recounted Eliphas Levi's supposed evocation of Apollonius of Tyana, complete with elaborate details of rituals and apparitions. Susie, thoroughly entertained, declared the story delightful. Haddo then shared his own experience evoking his deceased father, who advised him to invest in Ashantis, an investment that proved disastrous. Susie laughed, but Arthur remained impatient, frustrated by Haddo's constant oscillation between seriousness and mockery. The chapter ends with this unresolved tension, leaving the reader to ponder the true nature of Oliver Haddo and the implications of his presence in their lives. Chapter 6. 2 days later, Arthur received Frank Hurrell's long-awaited reply. The letter, characteristic of Frank's meticulous nature, provided a detailed and unsettling portrait of Oliver Haddo. It was clear that Frank, a man of scientific temperament, was both fascinated and repulsed by Haddo's complex personality. Frank's letter began by expressing surprise at Arthur's inquiry, noting the stark contrast between Arthur's robust common sense and Haddo's eccentricities. He clarified that, while he had known Haddo at Oxford, their relationship had never progressed beyond a reluctant acquaintance. Haddo's Oxford days were marked by a paradoxical blend of athletic prowess and social ostracization. Despite his potential for athletic glory, Haddo's scorn for conventional pursuits and brutal approach to sports earned him widespread dislike. Frank described him as taking advantages which most people would have thought mean, and exulting over victories with coarse banter. In stark contrast to his present corpulence, Haddo had been remarkably handsome as a young man, resembling a colossal statue of Apollo. His tall, well-proportioned figure, combined with his dashing erectness, which some perceived as arrogance, and abundant curling hair, made him a figure of striking physical presence. Frank also noted Haddo's unusual eyes, which remained parallel when focused on an object, creating an unsettling impression of penetrating scrutiny. His flamboyant attire, often featuring outrageous colors or excessively formal wear, further contributed to his notoriety. Despite his unpopularity, Haddo was a constant presence in Oxford society, drawing people to him with an undeniable, if unsettling, fascination. Frank confessed to experiencing this pull himself, despite his personal dislike for Haddo. He attributed this attraction to Haddo's unpredictability and the charm of the unexpected, which resonated with the romantic sensibilities hidden beneath the undergraduate's practical exterior. Haddo's coarse humor, gift for caricature, and inventive profanity further cemented his position as a figure of both amusement and irritation. Haddo's vast and varied knowledge, coupled with a remarkable memory and quick wit, allowed him to project an air of omniscience. Frank recounted instances where Haddo had seemingly quoted obscure text verbatim, leaving others bewildered. He also highlighted Haddo's pride in his distinguished lineage, confirming the veracity of his claims of noble ancestry and ownership of a historic estate in Staffordshire. Haddo's Oxford career culminated in a surprising first-class degree, after which he vanished from the university scene. Rumors of his subsequent travels circulated, from tramping across America to residing in an Indian monastery, marrying a ballet dancer in Milan, or succumbing to alcoholism. The only consistent thread was the certainty that Haddo was leading an extraordinary life. Frank then recounted a chance meeting with Haddo in Piccadilly, where he found him significantly changed, enormously stout and prematurely aged. Haddo remained evasive about his experiences, hinting at journeys to uncharted territories and the acquisition of esoteric knowledge. Frank found him coarsened and his former brilliance diminished. The most revealing part of Frank's letter concerned a dinner with the German explorer Burckhardt. Burckhardt confirmed Haddo's exceptional abilities as a big-game hunter, recounting the extraordinary feat of killing 3 lions with 3 consecutive shots. He also described Haddo's uncanny instincts for tracking and his remarkable courage when facing dangerous game. However, Burckhardt also revealed Haddo's darker side: his wanton killing, extreme selfishness, and cruel treatment of native peoples, culminating in a fatal altercation that led to their separation. Frank concluded his letter with a stark warning: "I recommend you to avoid him like the plague. He can be no one's friend." As an acquaintance, he is treacherous and insincere. As an enemy, I can well imagine that he would be as merciless as he is unscrupulous. Arthur, after carefully rereading the letter, passed it to Susie. Her response, delivered within hours, was characteristic of her own fascination with the unusual. I've asked him to tea on Wednesday, and I can't put him off. You must come and help us. But please be as polite to him as if, like most of us, he had only taken mental liberties with the 10 Commandments. Chapter 7. On the morning of Haddo's scheduled tea visit, an extravagant display of chrysanthemums arrived at Margaret's studio, transforming the austere space with a vibrant, albeit fleeting, brightness. Arthur, arriving later, felt a pang of regret for his own lack of such a gesture. Margaret, however, reassured him, valuing his sincerity over conventional displays of affection. Susie playfully teased them both, setting a light-hearted tone before the impending arrival. The studio, bathed in the warm glow of lamplight and a cheerful fire, exuded an air of cozy intimacy and creative energy. The familiar banter between Arthur and Susie, marked by Susie's good-natured teasing of Arthur's love-struck behavior, underscored their comfortable dynamic. Susie, despite her light-hearted ribbing, held a deep respect for Arthur's solid character, honesty, and unwavering loyalty. Observing him gently stroking Margaret's terrier, she felt a poignant twinge of longing for a similar connection in her own life. Dr. Porhoët arrived with his characteristic quiet grace, content to observe the younger company. The scene, with its carefully arranged colors and the peaceful atmosphere, resembled a masterfully composed genre painting. Margaret, radiating a gentle, almost saintly beauty, moved with a delicate grace as she prepared tea. A knock at the door signaled Haddo's arrival. The terrier, previously relaxed in Arthur's lap, underwent an immediate transformation, slinking into a corner with its tail between its legs, its eyes fixed on Haddo with fear and suspicion. Haddo, however, remained oblivious, focusing on greeting his hosts with unexpected courtesy. He expressed genuine admiration for the studio and showed a surprising understanding of Margaret's sketches, revealing a discerning eye for art. Haddo's conversation, initially charming and engaging, hinted at the charisma that had captivated Oxford undergraduates. However, Susie, eager to delve into more substantial matters, steered the conversation towards alchemy, drawing upon Dr. Porhoët's book on the subject. The discussion touched upon the alchemist's pursuit of gold and their quest for power, both material and spiritual. Haddo, previously subdued, became animated, his voice gaining intensity as he spoke of the alchemist's desire for power over the whole world, power over all created things, power over the very elements, power over God himself. His eyes gleamed with a strange arrogance, and his words took on a darker, almost obsessive tone. He then recounted the story of Paracelsus and his experiments with homunculi, citing a German book detailing the creation of these artificial beings by Count von Kufstein. Haddo's narration, delivered in a low, unsteady voice, conveyed a palpable sense of fascination and unease. He described the homunculi's growth, their strange needs, and the tragic fate of one that was accidentally destroyed. Arthur, initially dismissive, questioned the purpose of creating such beings. Haddo responded passionately, arguing that it represented a profound exploration of existence and a desire to transcend human limitations, the desire to be as God. A low, chilling laugh escaped his lips, sending a shiver down Margaret's spine. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. Haddo's vehemence contrasted sharply with the previous light-hearted conversation. Dr. Porhoët, sensing the change, prepared to leave. As he bid farewell to Margaret's terrier, the dog, displaying an inexplicable fear, cowered at her feet. Haddo's harsh laugh echoed through the studio. As Dr. Porhoët exited, the terrier, as if possessed by a sudden fury, lunged at Haddo, biting his hand. Haddo cried out and kicked the dog savagely. A surge of rage overwhelmed Arthur. Fueled by the dog's pain, Margaret's terror, and his own deep-seated dislike of Haddo, he struck Haddo in the face, sending him crashing to the floor. He then proceeded to kick the fallen man, his anger momentarily blinding him. Haddo, surprisingly, offered no resistance. As Arthur turned to comfort Margaret and the injured dog, Susie was acutely aware of Haddo's presence behind them. A chilling tension filled the air as Haddo slowly rose to his feet, leaning against the wall, his gaze fixed on them. Susie, unable to bear the silence, glanced back. Haddo's face, contorted with hatred, was a horrifying sight. But then, the redness of his anger gave way to a ghastly pallor, and a torpid smile spread across his features. A smile even more terrifying than his previous scowl. Haddo moved forward, his voice low and distinct. "I want to ask you to forgive me for what I did," he said, offering an abject apology for kicking the dog. Margaret, unable to meet his gaze, barely whispered her response. "I think, if you don't mind, you had better go away." Haddo bowed, looked at Arthur, and said, "I wish to tell you that I bear no malice for what you did. I recognize the justice of your anger." Arthur remained silent. Haddo hesitated, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips before retrieving his hat, bowing again, and departing, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease and dread. Chapter 8. Susie remained deeply unsettled by Haddo's sudden display of humility. The memory of his fleeting, venomous smile, quickly replaced by an air of contrition, fueled her suspicion. Dark visions of Haddo's potential revenge plagued her, and she repeatedly warned Arthur, only to be met with dismissive laughter. "The man's a coward," Arthur scoffed. "If he had any fight in him, he wouldn't have let me kick him without defending himself." Haddo's perceived lack of resistance only deepened Arthur's contempt. He found Susie's anxieties amusing. What could he possibly do? Drop a brick on my head? If he shot me, he'd face the consequences. He's not foolish enough to risk that. Margaret, however, found no such easy reassurance. The incident, far from dismissing Haddo from her thoughts, had left a lingering unease. A chance encounter in the street, where Haddo offered a perfunctory greeting, only served to sharpen her desire to leave Paris and begin her life with Arthur. She pressed him to finalize their wedding plans, seeking the tangible security of marriage. Then came the interruption, a telegram for Susie. "Please meet me at the Gare du Nord, 240. Nancy Clerk." It was a message from an old friend, whose photograph, bearing a bold signature, sat on Susie's mantelpiece. The unexpected urgency of the message surprised Susie. "What a nuisance," she sighed. "I suppose I have to go." The planned tea across the river was abandoned. The journey to the station was too time-consuming for Susie to return in time. They agreed to meet later at their original destination. Susie departed shortly before 2. Margaret, leaving for her class just minutes later, experienced a sudden, chilling premonition as Haddo materialized in the courtyard. He seemed not to notice her, then abruptly stopped, clutched his chest, and collapsed heavily to the ground. The concierge, the sole witness, cried out in alarm, summoning Margaret. Against her better judgment, Margaret approached. Haddo lay still, seemingly lifeless. For a moment, she forgot her loathing and knelt beside him, instinctively loosening his collar. His eyes flickered open, filled with a desperate, agonizing plea. "For the love of God, take me in for one moment," he choked. "I shall die in the street." A wave of pity washed over Margaret. She couldn't leave him in the concierge's cramped, foul-smelling room. With considerable effort, she helped him to his feet, and together they made their way to her studio. He sank heavily into a chair. "Shall I get you some water?" Margaret asked. "Can you find a pastille in my pocket?" he gasped. She retrieved a small white tablet from a case attached to his watch chain, which he quickly swallowed. "I'm so sorry to cause you this trouble," he managed, explaining his heart condition. "I'm glad I could help," Margaret replied, her tone cool. As Haddo's breathing eased, Margaret retreated, picking up a book and attempting to read. But the silence was thick with tension. Then, without moving, Haddo spoke, his voice regaining strength. "You must hate me for intruding." Margaret's pity began to evaporate as Haddo's apparent recovery progressed. Her response was icily indifferent. "I would have done the same for a dog. I see you wish me to leave." Haddo rose, only to stagger and fall to his knees with a groan. Margaret, instantly contrite, rushed to his side, berating herself for her harshness. "Oh, please stay as long as you need," she cried. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." Haddo, with great difficulty, pulled himself back into the chair. Margaret, consumed by guilt, hovered helplessly. She offered him water, but he waved it away, refusing even this small act of charity. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice strained. "Nothing," he gasped, "except allow me to sit here." Margaret, her conscience weighing heavily, retreated once more, feigning absorption in her book. After a short silence, Haddo spoke again, his voice distant and weak. "Will you never forgive me for what happened the other day?" Margaret, her back still turned, replied curtly, "Does it matter to you whether I forgive you or not?" "You have no pity," Haddo murmured. "I told you how sorry I was. It was a sudden, uncontrollable pain. Don't you think it was difficult for me, under the circumstances, to confess my fault?" "I don't want to talk about it," Margaret said, her voice tight. "I don't want to think about that horrible scene. If you knew how lonely I am, how unhappy," Haddo's voice trembled with emotion, "you would have some mercy." Margaret could no longer doubt his sincerity. "You think me a charlatan because I pursue things you don't understand," he continued. "You refuse to see that I'm striving with all my soul towards a great end." Margaret remained silent. Another pause hung heavy in the air. Then, Haddo's voice shifted, becoming strangely seductive. "You look at me with disgust, with scorn," he whispered. "You almost left me to die in the street. If you hadn't been merciful, almost against your will, I would be dead now." "It makes no difference to me how I regard you," Margaret whispered back, though a strange unease stirred within her. She couldn't understand the way his soft words affected her, quickening her pulse. "It makes all the difference," Haddo insisted. "Your contempt is unbearable. I feel your goodness, your purity. I feel so unworthy. You turn away as if I were unclean." Slowly, Margaret turned to face him. She was struck by the change in his appearance. His obesity no longer seemed repulsive. His eyes, now moist with tears, held an expression of profound tenderness. His mouth was drawn in a mask of passionate distress. Margaret had never seen such raw unhappiness on a man's face, and a wave of overwhelming remorse washed over her. "I don't want to be unkind," she said softly. "I will leave," Haddo replied, his voice laced with bitterness and humiliation. "It's the best way to repay your kindness." The words stung Margaret, bringing a flush to her cheeks. "Please," she urged, "stay, but let's talk of other things." Haddo fell silent, his gaze drifting to a print of the Mona Lisa on the wall. Then he began to speak, reciting Walter Pater's famous description, his voice weaving a spell, imbuing the words with a profound emotional resonance. He continued, his voice deepening with a rich, resonant quality, evoking images of the Mona Lisa as a timeless, almost supernatural figure, embodying the accumulated experience and passions of centuries. Then, Haddo shifted the conversation to a broader analysis of art, focusing on themes of desire, decadence, and mortality. He conjured images of Bronzino's cruel yet indifferent sculptor, Ribera's ghoulish dwarfs, and Valdez Leal's decaying priest, creating a disturbing tapestry of morbid beauty. He turned to Gustave Moreau, imbuing his paintings with a new, esoteric significance, connecting them to sin, vice, and introspective torment. Margaret listened, breathless, with the rapt attention of an explorer gazing upon an uncharted continent. The imaginative depth of Haddo's interpretation was unlike anything she had experienced before. She was both horrified and fascinated by the sheer force of his personality, which permeated every word. His gaze remained fixed on hers, and she felt herself responding to his pronouncements like a finely tuned instrument, registering every subtle shift in his emotional intensity. A strange languor began to creep over her. When he finally paused, Margaret was speechless, almost paralyzed. She felt as if she were under a spell, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. "I want to repay your kindness," Haddo said, rising and moving towards the piano. "Sit here." Margaret obeyed without question. Haddo began to play, and, though not entirely surprised by his virtuosity, she was nonetheless astonished by the tenderness of his touch. His large hands moved over the keys with surprising grace, drawing forth sounds of unexpected depth and emotion. He infused the music with a troubling, ambiguous passion, making the instrument seem almost sentient. The music was vaguely familiar, yet under Haddo's touch, it took on an exotic, unsettling quality that resonated with his earlier pronouncements. His musical selection seemed perfectly attuned to Margaret's unspoken emotions, fulfilling a deep, unarticulated need. Then, he began to play unfamiliar pieces, barbaric melodies with a plaintive, otherworldly quality. They conjured visions of moonlit deserts, silent palm trees, and vast, tawny landscapes. Margaret imagined winding, white-walled streets, bathed in moonlight and the glow of hidden lamps, the tinkling of strange instruments, and the pungent scents of Eastern perfumes. A procession of otherworldly figures passed through her mind. Mona Lisa, John the Baptist, Bacchus, the Virgin Mary, all moving with enigmatic grace. Salome, however, stood. Chapter 9. Margaret's sleep offered no respite. The following day, a profound unease settled upon her, disrupting her work and her peace. She wrestled with the events of the previous day, desperately seeking a rational explanation. Susie's telegram, she told herself, was a calculated maneuver by Haddo, his feigned illness a mere ruse to gain entry to her studio. Once inside, he had preyed upon her compassion, exploiting it to unleash his hypnotic power, conjuring the disturbing visions that now haunted her. Yet, despite her attempts to frame him as a manipulative trickster who had shamelessly taken advantage of her pity, she couldn't summon anger. Contempt and loathing were now intertwined with a growing horror, a chilling dread that clung to her like a shroud. Haddo's presence dominated her thoughts. His words, the visions he had conjured, seemed to possess a life of their own, growing within her, insidiously consuming her. It was as if a poisonous weed had taken root in her heart, its tendrils snaking through her veins, poisoning her very essence. Work offered no distraction, nor did conversation, exercise, or art. Between her and the world stood the flamboyant, bulky form of Oliver Haddo. Fear, more profound than any she had ever known, gripped her. Yet the physical revulsion that had once defined her feelings for him had strangely receded. Though she repeated like a mantra that she never wanted to see him again, an overwhelming, almost irresistible desire pulled her towards him. Her will had been stolen. She was an automaton, a puppet dancing to his tune. She struggled against this compulsion. A bird trapped in a fowler's net, its wings beating uselessly against the invisible bars. Deep down, a chilling whisper told her she didn't truly want to escape. The address he had given her felt like a preordained destination, a certainty that she would use it. She didn't know why she needed to go. She had nothing to say. She only knew that she had to. The memory of Racine's Phaedra, which she had recently seen performed, echoed in her mind, and she felt a chilling kinship with the tragic queen, wrestling with a consuming, forbidden passion. A poison poured into her veins by cruel gods. A frantic question echoed in her mind. Had she been placed under a spell? She was now ready to believe that Haddo's power was absolute. She knew that yielding to this temptation would lead to her destruction. She longed to confide in Arthur or Susie, but a nameless force held her back, silencing her pleas for help. Driven to the edge of despair, she briefly considered seeking help from Dr. Porhoët, hoping he might offer some understanding, some solace. But when she rushed to his house, she was met with the news that he was out. Her heart sank. Her last vestige of hope seemed to vanish. She felt like a drowning soul clinging to a rock, the waves of despair crashing against her, relentlessly tearing her from her only refuge. Abandoning her evening sketch class, she found herself drawn, as if by an invisible thread, to the address Haddo had given her. She hurried through the crowded streets, her heart a tumultuous mix of fear and anticipation, as if pursued by unseen eyes. She desperately wanted to turn back, yet her feet carried her forward, driven by a force beyond her control. She ran up the stairs and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and Oliver Haddo stood before her, his expression betraying no surprise. As she stood on the landing, the thought struck her that she had no reason to offer for her visit, but Haddo's words preempted any need for explanation. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and resonant. He led her into a sparsely furnished sitting room in a maison meublée. The heavy drapes and generic furniture seemed strangely out of place in connection with him, their very ordinariness emphasizing his unsettling presence. The room lacked any warmth or comfort, suggesting his complete indifference to material surroundings. Though spacious, it felt cramped, cluttered. Haddo moved with a deliberate, almost cautious grace among the heavy furniture, his obesity somehow more pronounced in this impersonal setting. The same acrid Eastern perfume that had pervaded her disturbing vision now hung heavy in the air. Inviting her to sit, he began to speak as if they were old friends, as if nothing untoward had occurred. Finally, Margaret summoned her courage. "Why did you make me come here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You give me credit for remarkable powers," he replied with a subtle smile. "You knew I would come." "I did. What have I done to you that you should make me so unhappy? I want you to leave me alone. I won't prevent you from leaving if you choose. No harm has come to you. The door is open." Her heart pounded painfully in her chest, and she fell silent. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that she didn't want to leave. An invisible force bound her to him, and she was losing the will to resist. A strange sensation began to creep through her limbs, a terrifying yet strangely exhilarating mix of fear and anticipation. He began to speak in that low, hypnotic voice that held such a strange power over her. He no longer spoke of art or books, but of life itself. He painted vivid pictures of exotic Eastern lands untouched by Western influence. Dawn breaking over silent, ancient cities, moonlit desert nights, sunsets ablaze with color. He described richly woven fabrics, silken carpets, damascened armor, and priceless gems. The splendor of the East shimmered before her eyes. He spoke of frankincense, myrrh, and aloes, of heavy perfumes and drowsy garden scents. The very air seemed to thicken with these exotic fragrances. Through the power of his words, life itself was offered to her. A life of boundless vitality, freedom, and forbidden knowledge. A stark comparison formed in her mind between the narrow, conventional life that awaited her as Arthur's wife and this alluring, unfettered existence. She shuddered at the thought of the dull house in Harley Street and its mundane routines. She, too, could experience the wonders of the world. A subtle suggestion, woven into the fabric of Haddo's words, whispered that her exquisite beauty entitled her to embrace the great art of living. A sudden, fierce desire for perilous adventures ignited within her. She sprang to her feet, her breath quickening, her eyes blazing with the vivid images his words had conjured. Haddo rose to meet her, and they stood facing each other. Then, with sudden, devastating clarity, she understood the nature of the passion that consumed her. With a swift, decisive movement, his eyes burning with an unnerving intensity, he took her in his arms and kissed her. She surrendered completely, her body consumed by the intoxicating heat of his embrace. "I think I love you," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. She looked at him, strangely devoid of shame. "Now you must go," he said, his voice flat and dismissive, as if the intimacy they had just shared meant nothing. He opened the door, and without another word, she left. She walked through the streets in a daze, as if nothing had happened, feeling neither remorse nor revulsion, only a strange emptiness. The days that followed were consumed by an uncontrollable craving to return to Haddo. Though she made feeble attempts to resist, she knew they were merely a pretense. A dark part of her relished the surrender. Any obstacle that threatened to keep her from him filled her with a barely suppressed rage. A constant, gnawing hunger drove her back to his presence, and the only moments of respite, of a twisted kind of happiness, were those spent in his company. Each encounter culminated in the same intoxicating yet repulsive embrace, his massive arms crushing her against him, his sensual lips pressing against hers. The ecstasy was inextricably bound with loathing, the physical attraction intertwined with a profound sense of disgust. Yet, when he fixed her with those pale, unsettling eyes and infused his voice with those hypnotic inflections, she forgot everything. He spoke of unhallowed things, lifting the veil on terrifying secrets, revealing glimpses of a world beyond human comprehension. She understood, with a chilling clarity, how men had bartered their souls for forbidden knowledge. She felt as though she stood on a precarious precipice, with spiritual kingdoms of darkness and the principalities of the unknown spread out before her, tempting her towards the abyss. But about Haddo himself, she learned nothing. She didn't know if he loved her, or if he was capable of love at all. He seemed detached, inhuman, a being apart. She discovered by chance that his mother was alive, but he refused to speak of her, offering only the cryptic promise, "Someday you shall meet her." Meanwhile, Margaret maintained the facade of her normal life. Deceiving her friends became disturbingly easy. Neither Arthur nor Susie suspected the truth behind her frequent absences. The lies, once so difficult to utter, now tripped effortlessly from her tongue. Yet, despite their ease, a constant fear of discovery gnawed at her, and at night, consumed by remorse, she would lie awake, tormented by the shame of her betrayal of Arthur. But she felt trapped, carried along by a current she couldn't fight. She barely understood the transformation in her feelings for Arthur. Haddo had rarely even mentioned his name, yet he had poisoned her mind against him. The comparison between the two men was always to Arthur's detriment. She now found him dull, his conventional worldview a stark contrast to Haddo's captivating darkness. She even began to resent Arthur for his unwavering kindness, his sacrifices for her. His very generosity felt like a form of obligation, binding her to a future she no longer desired. Yet, she continued to discuss wedding plans with him, detailing the furnishings for their house in Harley Street. She had dreamed of a Louis XV drawing room, and they spent hours searching for antique chairs and silk fabrics. Everything had to be perfect, a hollow echo of a future that would never be. The wedding date was set, the details finalized. Arthur was radiant with happiness, oblivious to the storm raging within her. Margaret offered no resistance, speaking of the future only to maintain the deception. Inwardly, she was convinced the marriage would never take place, though she couldn't explain what would prevent it. She watched Susie and Arthur with a cunning vigilance, and in doing so, she uncovered a secret of her own. Susie was deeply, hopelessly in love with Arthur. The discovery struck Margaret as both shocking and absurd. "You never did that caricature of Arthur you promised," she remarked one day. "I tried, but he doesn't lend himself to it," Susie replied with a forced laugh. "With that long nose and gaunt figure, I thought you could make something hilariously funny. How oddly you speak of him." Susie's tone shifted, becoming softer. "I only see his kind eyes and gentle smile. I could as soon caricature him as parody a beloved poem." Margaret picked up Susie's portfolio. She noticed a flash of alarm cross Susie's face, but Susie lacked the courage to stop her. Margaret flipped through the drawings, feigning disinterest, until she came across a sheet filled with sketches of Arthur's head, in various stages of completion. Pretending not to notice, she continued to the end of the portfolio. When she closed it, Susie let out a sigh of relief. "I wish you'd work harder," Margaret said, placing the portfolio down. "I wonder you don't do a proper portrait of Arthur, since you can't manage a caricature." "My dear, you mustn't expect everyone to be as overwhelmingly interested in that young man as you are," Susie retorted, a hint of bitterness in her voice. Susie's reply confirmed Margaret's suspicions. She felt a surge of resentment, telling herself that Susie was as much a liar as she was. The next day, while Susie was out, Margaret secretly examined the portfolio again. The sketches of Arthur had vanished. A sudden wave of anger washed over her. How dare Susie love the man who loved her? The web Haddo had woven around her was intricate and insidious. He had skillfully exploited every facet of her personality, strengthening his hold over her with a calculated precision that bordered on the diabolical. It was almost unbelievable that he had transformed her initial abhorrence into this consuming passion in such a short time. Margaret could no longer imagine her life apart from him. And then, he made his final move. "It may interest you to know that I'm leaving Paris on Thursday," he said casually one afternoon. She stood abruptly, staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "But what will become of me?" "You will marry the excellent Mr. Burdon. You know I cannot live without you. How can you be so cruel?" "Then the only alternative is that you won't accompany me." The words struck her like a physical blow. Her blood ran cold, and her heart felt as if it were being squeezed in an iron vise. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's no need for agitation. I'm making you an eminently desirable offer of marriage." She sank weakly into a chair. Because she had refused to consider the future, it had never occurred to her that she would eventually have to choose between leaving Haddo and committing herself to him entirely. A wave of revulsion washed over her. She saw him clearly for what he was, a dangerous, manipulative man who had ensnared her in his web. She remembered Arthur's unwavering love, his sacrifices, and a wave of self-loathing engulfed her. Like a trapped bird, she made a desperate, futile attempt to regain her freedom. She jumped to her feet. "Let me go. I wish I'd never met you. I don't know what you've done to me." "Go, by all means, if you choose," he replied, opening the door wide, a hateful smile twisting his lips. His immense bulk seemed even more grotesque in that moment. The folds of fat beneath his chin concealed his neck, and his large, clean-shaven face seemed almost obscene. Margaret paused as she passed him, caught between repulsion and a terrible fascination. A powerful, almost uncontrollable urge swept over her, a desperate longing for him to take her in his arms again, to kiss her with his full, sensual lips. It was as if some demonic force was taking revenge on her beauty, inspiring this perverse desire for such a monstrous creature. She trembled with the intensity of it. His eyes were hard and cruel. "Go," he repeated, his voice cold and final. She lowered her head and fled from before him. To get home, she passed through the Luxembourg Gardens, but her legs failed her, and in exhaustion, she sank onto a bench. The day was heavy with a preternatural stillness. She tried to gather her thoughts, but they scattered like frightened birds. Margaret knew this part of the gardens well. In happier times, she had often come here to admire a particular tree, its delicate branches and fragile, autumnal leaves etched against the sky like a Japanese print. Now, the tree's beauty held no solace. A heartrending pang struck her as she realized that the exquisite things of art, of life itself, might never again hold meaning for her. She remembered her last conversation with Arthur, the lies she had told to explain her unavailability. He had suggested a trip to Versailles, and his disappointment at her refusal had been palpable. He had accepted her excuse, a visit to a sick friend, with his usual unwavering trust. It would have been easier if he had suspected her deception, if his reproaches had hardened her heart. But it was his complete faith in her that was so unbearable. "Oh, if I could only confess everything," she whispered to the empty air, the words catching in her throat. The bells of St. Sulpice began to toll for Vespers. Seeking some semblance of peace, Margaret wandered towards the church and sat among the poor in the transept. The dim light and simple grandeur of the space offered a momentary respite. In her exhaustion, she watched the comings and goings of the worshippers. Behind her, a priest sat in the confessional. A young peasant girl, perhaps a newly arrived maidservant, knelt before him, murmuring her confession. Margaret could hear the faint murmur of her words and the deep response of the priest. In a few minutes, the girl rose and departed, her face fresh and innocent. Margaret felt a sharp pang of envy. The child's sins were likely small, easily forgiven, her spirit untouched by the darkness that now consumed Margaret. She longed to confess her own burden, but she knew the priest's faith and hers were no longer the same. They spoke different languages, not of words but of the soul. He would not understand her, nor would he offer absolution to a heart so deeply entangled in sin. A procession of seminarists entered, their black cassocks and white surplices moving in rhythmic pairs. Margaret watched their faces, wondering if they knew such torment. But they had their faith, their unwavering belief to sustain them. Even those with narrow, unyielding faces possessed a certainty that shielded them from the treacherous paths she had chosen. The canons followed, their vestments more ornate, and finally the officiating clergy. The music began, a stately, sorrowful melody that seemed perfectly suited to the sacred space. But it offered her no comfort. The Latin chants were foreign to her, the rituals meaningless. A silent cry echoed in her heart. God had forsaken her. She was utterly alone, adrift in a hostile land. Evil surrounded her, and the sacred ceremonies offered no refuge. Unable to bear the weight of her despair, she rose and fled the church, tears streaming down her face. As she walked the long, desolate street towards home, she repeated the same desolate phrase, "God has forsaken me. God has forsaken me." The next day, her eyes swollen and red from weeping, she dragged herself to Haddo's door. He opened it without a word, his gaze fixed on her. She entered in silence and sat down, and he watched her, his expression unreadable. "I am willing to marry you whenever you choose," she said at last, her voice flat and lifeless. "I have made all the necessary arrangements," he replied. "You spoke of your mother. Will you take me to her?" A flicker of a smile crossed his lips. "If you wish it." Haddo informed her that they could be married before the consul early Thursday morning, allowing them to catch a train to England. She left everything in his hands, her will completely surrendered. "I'm desperately unhappy," she murmured. Oliver placed his hands on her shoulders, his pale eyes boring into hers. "Go home, and you will forget your tears. I command you to be happy." In that moment, the internal battle between good and evil seemed to cease. Evil had triumphed. A strange, chilling elation washed over her. The deception of her friends no longer mattered. A bitter laugh escaped her lips as she considered how easily she had fooled them. Wednesday, Arthur's birthday, arrived. He had planned a special dinner for them. Margaret, dressed with meticulous care, stood before the mirror, surveying her reflection. Susie, observing her, remarked on her heightened beauty, the newfound depth and mystery in her eyes. Unbeknownst to Susie, this depth was the shadow of her impending betrayal. Arthur arrived, and Margaret met his gaze, a strange, enigmatic smile playing on her lips. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. The lavish dinner, the champagne, Arthur's radiant happiness. It all felt like a grotesque parody to Margaret. She played her part flawlessly, laughing and making light conversation, all the while knowing the devastating blow that awaited him. As they parted that night, Arthur's words, "I feel that, however long I live, I shall never have a happier day than this," echoed in her ears like a curse. She knew she was stealing his happiness, shattering his world, but she was powerless to stop it. The train for England departed at noon on Thursday, and with it went Margaret, now Mrs. Oliver Haddo, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and shattered trust. Chapter 10. Chapter 10. The Unraveling. Susie stared at the Petit Bleu, the flimsy paper a stark messenger of devastating news. The words, pinned in Margaret's hand, were like a physical blow. "When you receive this, I shall be on my way to London. I was married to Oliver Haddo this morning. I love him as I never loved Arthur. I have acted in this manner because I thought I had gone too far with Arthur to make an explanation possible. Please tell him." Margaret. Disbelief warred with a rising tide of dread. Susie's mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the sheer impossibility of it. A knock at the door announced Arthur's arrival, expected at midday. Susie knew she couldn't deliver such a devastating blow unprepared. She needed time to gather the facts, to understand the incomprehensible. With a heavy heart, she opened the door, forcing a strained smile. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Margaret isn't here," she stammered, offering a hastily constructed lie. "A friend of hers is ill and sent for her suddenly." "What a bore," Arthur replied, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "Mrs. Bloomfield, as usual, I suppose?" "Oh, you know she's been ill?" Susie asked, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Margaret spent nearly every afternoon with her for the past few days. Susie's unease deepened. This was news to her, a jarring dissonance in the carefully constructed image Margaret had presented. Her immediate concern, however, was to shield Arthur from the truth, at least for the moment. "Won't you come back at 5 o'clock?" she suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "But look here, why shouldn't we have lunch together? Just you and I?" he protested, his disappointment evident. "I'm terribly sorry, but I'm expecting someone," Susie lied, her guilt intensifying. "Oh, all right, then I'll come back at 5. He nodded and departed, unaware of the devastating truth that awaited him. Susie reread the note, the stark words now imbued with a chilling finality. The callousness, the blatant disregard for Arthur's feelings, was appalling. She went to Margaret's room, a desperate hope flickering within her that she might find some clue, some explanation. But the room offered only further confirmation. Though seemingly in order, she discovered burned letters in the fireplace and noticed that Margaret's jewelry was missing. A chilling thought struck her. Margaret's recently purchased trousseau. She had insisted it be sent directly to her dressmaker, citing convenience. Susie rushed to the dressmaker, confirming that the boxes had been dispatched to the Gare du Nord luggage office the previous day. The dressmaker casually mentioned that Margaret had paid for everything days ago, confirming Susie's worst fears. Margaret had used Arthur's money to finance her elopement with Haddo. Susie then made a crucial stop, Mrs. Bloomfield's residence. The invalid, surprised to see her, expressed confusion at Margaret's absence. "I haven't seen Margaret for 3 weeks, she stated, shattering the foundation of Margaret's carefully constructed alibi. Susie, feigning casual interest, pressed for details, realizing with growing horror that Margaret's afternoons had been spent not with a sick friend, but with Haddo. Her final stop was the British consulate, where the grim truth was confirmed. Margaret and Haddo were indeed married. All that remained was to face Arthur. Returning to the studio, Susie wrestled with the burden of her knowledge. The thought of inflicting such pain on Arthur, a man she secretly loved, was unbearable. She pictured his face, the joy she had witnessed just the night before, now destined to be replaced by unimaginable grief. Precisely at 5, Arthur arrived, his face alight with anticipation. "Is Margaret not here yet?" he asked, his brow furrowed with mild surprise. "Won't you sit down?" Susie managed, her voice strained. He didn't notice the change in her demeanor, the averted gaze. "How lazy you are," he teased. "You haven't even made tea." Susie took a deep breath, steeling herself for the agonizing task ahead. "Mr. Burdon," she began, her voice hoarse with emotion, "I have something to tell you. It will cause you very great pain." The light in Arthur's eyes faded, replaced by a flicker of apprehension. He sprang to his feet, 1,000 terrifying possibilities flashing through his mind. Something terrible had happened to Margaret. She was ill, perhaps even. His fear was so intense he couldn't speak, his hands outstretched as if groping in the dark. Susie, her own heart breaking, thrust the petit bleu into his trembling hands. "What does it mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on the note. Susie, her voice choked with tears, recounted the events of the day, the visits to the dressmaker, Mrs. Bloomfield, the consulate. "When you thought she was with Mrs. Bloomfield," she said, her voice trembling, "she was with him. She planned it all with meticulous care. It was premeditated." Arthur sank into a chair, his head bowed, his back turned to Susie as if to shield her from the devastation etched on his face. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Susie, her own heart breaking for the man she loved, began to weep silently. A sudden surge of rage, of bitter resentment towards Margaret, erupted within her. "Oh, it's infamous," she cried, her voice laced with anger. "She's lied to you. She's been odiously deceitful. She must be vile, heartless, rotten to the very soul." Arthur turned sharply, his voice hard, a stark contrast to his usual gentle tone. "I forbid you to say anything against her." Susie gasped, taken aback by his unexpected vehemence. He had never spoken to her in anger before. Can you still love her? She retorted bitterly. After such vile treachery? For nearly a month, this man has been making love to her, and she's listened to everything we've said about him. She's pretended to hate the sight of him. I've seen her cut him in the street. She's continued with all the wedding preparations. She's lived in a world of lies, and you never suspected a thing because you had such unwavering faith in her love and truthfulness. She owes everything to you. For 4 years, she's lived on your charity. She's only been able to be here because you gave her money to pursue a foolish whim, and the very clothes on her back were paid for by you. I can't help it if she didn't love me, Arthur cried, his voice laced with despair. You know as well as I do that she pretended to love you, Susie insisted, her anger refusing to be quelled. She's behaved shamefully. There can be no excuse for her. Arthur looked at Susie with haggard, miserable eyes. How can you be so cruel? He pleaded, his voice cracking with pain. For God's sake, don't make it harder. The raw agony in his voice shattered Susie's anger. As if his own words had finally broken the dam of his self-control, he broke down, burying his face in his hands and sobbing uncontrollably. Susie, stricken with guilt, rushed to his side. Oh, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. I didn't mean to say such hateful things. I didn't mean to be unkind. I should have remembered how passionately you love her. The sight of his shattered composure was agonizing. Susie felt his pain as if it were her own. Her impulse was to kneel before him, to offer comfort, but she knew her place. She knew he saw her only as Margaret's friend, a painful reminder of his loss. Finally, Arthur regained a semblance of control, silently filling his pipe and lighting it, his movements stiff and mechanical. Susie was terrified by the change in his demeanor. She had always sensed a capacity for deep suffering in his rugged features, but she had never witnessed such raw, unutterable pain. His face was etched with a profound sorrow, a mask of utter desolation. I can't believe it's true, he muttered, the words barely audible, as if he were trying to convince himself. I can't believe it. A knock at the door startled him, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in his eyes. Perhaps she's come back, he whispered, rushing to open it. But it wasn't Margaret. It was Dr. Porhoët. How do you do? The doctor greeted them, his brow furrowed with concern. What is happening? He took in the scene. Arthur's ravaged face, Susie's tear-stained cheeks. Where is Miss Margaret? I thought you must be giving a party. Something in his manner prompted Susie to ask why he had come. I received a telegram from Mr. Haddo this morning, he explained, producing a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to Susie, who read it quickly and passed it to Arthur. The message was brief, chilling in its starkness. Come to the studio at 5. Hi, Jinx. Oliver Haddo. Margaret was married to Mr. Haddo this morning, Arthur stated flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. I understand they have gone to England. Susie quickly filled Dr. Porhoët in on the details she had uncovered. The doctor was as shocked and distressed as they were. But what is the explanation for all of this? He asked, his voice filled with bewilderment. Arthur simply shrugged, a gesture of weary resignation. She cared for Haddo more than she cared for me, I suppose. It's natural enough that she would choose this way to leave rather than offer explanations. She probably wanted to avoid a painful scene. When did you last see her? Dr. Porhoët inquired. We spent yesterday evening together, and she gave no indication of such a plan? Arthur shook his head slowly. None at all. We've never quarreled. She was in the best of spirits. I've never seen her more gay. She spoke constantly of our house in London, of the places we would visit after we were married. A fresh wave of pain washed over his face as he recalled her unusual affection that evening. The memory of her kisses still burned on his lips. He had spent a sleepless night in a state of near ecstasy, finally believing that the passion that consumed him was reciprocated. The words seemed to be wrenched from him against his will. Oh, I'm sure she loved me. Meanwhile, Susie's gaze remained fixed on Haddo's cruel telegram. She could almost hear his mocking laughter echoing in the stark message. Margaret loathed Oliver Haddo, she insisted. her voice trembling with anger and confusion. It was an almost unnatural hatred, a physical repulsion like some people have for certain animals. What could have happened to transform that into such love? Enough to drive her to such a treacherous act? We mustn't be unfair to him, Arthur countered weakly, desperately trying to find some semblance of reason in the chaos. We were prejudiced against him, perhaps unjust. He's accomplished remarkable things. He's no fool. It's possible some people wouldn't mind the eccentricities that irritated us. He's certainly from a good family, and he's wealthy. In many ways, it's an excellent match for Margaret. He was grasping at straws, trying to find any explanation that would lessen the unbearable weight of her betrayal. But as the image of Haddo rose in his mind, monstrously obese, vulgar, and overbearing, a shudder ran through him. The thought of Margaret in that man's arms twisted in his gut like a knife. "Perhaps it's not true," he cried, a desperate plea clinging to the hope of a miracle. "Perhaps she'll come back. Would you take her back if she did?" Susie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think anything she could do could make me love her less?" He responded, his voice thick with emotion. "There must be reasons we don't understand, reasons that drove her to this. Perhaps it was inevitable from the beginning." Dr. Porhoët rose and began to pace the room, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "If a woman had inflicted such an injury upon me, and I desired a truly cruel revenge," he said slowly, his voice laced with a chilling intensity, "I could devise nothing more subtly devastating than to let her be married to Oliver Haddo." "Ah, poor thing, Arthur murmured, his voice filled with anguish. "If only I could believe she would be happy. The future terrifies me. I wonder if she even knew that Haddo sent that telegram," Susie mused, her eyes still fixed on the cruel message. "What does it matter?" Arthur asked, his voice laced with despair. Susie turned to him, her expression grave. "Do you remember that day, in this very studio, when he kicked Margaret's dog, and you thrashed him?" she asked. "Afterwards, when he thought no one was watching, I saw his face. I've never seen such malignant hatred. It was the face of a fiend, and when he tried to excuse himself, there was a cruel gleam in his eyes that terrified me. I warned you. I told you he was seeking revenge, but you dismissed it. Then he seemed to disappear from our lives, and I forgot about it. I wonder if he sent Dr. Porhoët here today intentionally. He must have known the doctor would hear of his triumph. I think, in that moment, he vowed to have his revenge, and he devised this odious scheme. How could he have known he could carry out something so horrible?" Arthur whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "I wonder if Miss Boyd is right," murmured the doctor, his eyes narrowed in thought. "After all, if you consider it, he couldn't have devised a more effective way to hurt you. The entire situation is diabolical. He has stolen your happiness, knowing that nothing in the world meant more to you than making Margaret your wife. He has not only prevented that, but he has married her himself. And he could only have achieved this by poisoning her mind, by warping her very character. Her soul must be terribly stained. He must have completely altered her personality." "Ah, I feel it," Arthur cried, his voice breaking with emotion. "If Margaret has broken her word to me, if she has gone to him so callously, it's because she isn't the Margaret I knew. Some devil must have taken possession of her." "You speak figuratively," the doctor replied, his gaze fixed on Arthur. "But I wonder, could it be a reality?" Arthur and Dr. Porhoët stared at Susie, astonishment etched on their faces. "I can't believe Margaret could have done this," she continued, her voice trembling. "The more I think about it, the more impossible it seems. I've known her for years. She was incapable of such deceit. She was kind, honest, truthful. In the first shock of horror, I was only indignant, but I don't want to think so badly of her. There's only one way to explain it. She acted under some compulsion." Arthur clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "I'm not sure that doesn't make it even more awful," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. "If he married her not out of love, but simply to hurt me, what kind of life will she have with him? We know how heartless he is, how vindictive, how utterly cruel. Dr. Porhoët knows more about these things than we do, Susie said, turning to the doctor. Is it possible that Haddo cast some kind of spell on her, something that made her unable to resist his will? Is it possible he gained such influence over her that her entire character was changed? How can I know? The doctor exclaimed, throwing his hands up in a gesture of helplessness. I have heard of such things. I have read of them, but I have no proof. In these matters, all is shrouded in obscurity. The adepts of magic make extraordinary claims. Arthur is a man of science. He knows the limits of hypnotism. We know Haddo possessed powers beyond ordinary men, Susie countered. Perhaps there was some truth to his extravagant claims, enough to allow him to do something we can scarcely imagine. Arthur ran a weary hand across his face. I'm so broken, so confused. I can't think clearly. Everything seems possible now. My faith in everything I believed in is crumbling. A heavy silence fell over the room. Arthur's gaze rested on the chair where Margaret had often sat, an unfinished canvas still resting on the easel, a poignant reminder of their shared dreams. This section continues to develop the key themes, focusing on the escalating conflict, the hints of the supernatural, the psychological impact on the characters, and it was Dr. Porhoët who finally broke the silence. But even if there were some truth to Miss Boyd's suppositions, he said, his voice grave, I don't see how it helps you. There is nothing you can do. You have no recourse, legal or otherwise. Margaret is, by all appearances, a free agent. She has married this man. Many will likely think she has made a favorable match, marrying a wealthy gentleman rather than a young surgeon. Her letter is perfectly lucid. There is no hint of coercion. By all accounts, she has married him of her own free will, and there is nothing to suggest she desires to be released from him, or from the passion that we may assume holds her captive. His words, though delivered with compassion, were undeniably true. There was no argument against them. The only thing left is to endure it, Arthur said quietly, rising to his feet. Where are you going? Susie asked, her voice filled with concern. I need to leave Paris, he replied, his gaze distant. Everything here reminds me of what I've lost. I need to return to my work. He had regained a fragile composure, but the profound sorrow in his eyes betrayed the depth of his pain. He extended his hand to Susie. I only hope you can forget, she murmured, her own eyes filling with tears. I don't want to forget, he said, shaking his head slowly. It's possible you'll hear from Margaret. She'll likely want the things she left here, and will probably write to you. I'd like you to tell her that I hold no ill will towards her for anything she's done. I will never reproach her. I don't know if I can ever help her, but I want her to know that I will always do whatever she asks. If she writes, I'll tell her, Susie replied solemnly. And now goodbye. You can't leave for London until tomorrow. Won't I see you in the morning? She asked, a desperate plea in her voice. I'd rather not come here again, if you don't mind, he said, his voice strained. The sight of everything, it's too much. Another wave of pain washed over his face, and Susie saw the immense effort he was making to maintain his composure. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. Will I ever see you again? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I would be very sorry to lose touch completely. I would be sorry too, he replied, a faint trace of warmth returning to his voice. I've learned how good and kind you are, and I'll never forget that you were Margaret's friend. When you come to London, I hope you'll let me know. He turned and walked out, leaving Susie and Dr. Porhoët in the heavy silence of the studio. Dr. Porhoët, his hands clasped behind his back, began to pace slowly across the room. He stopped abruptly, turning to Susie with a thoughtful expression. There's one thing that continues to puzzle me, he said, his brow furrowed. Why did he marry her? You heard what Arthur said, Susie replied bitterly. Whatever happened, he would have taken her back. Haddo knew that the only way to bind her to him completely was through marriage. Dr. Porhoët shrugged, a gesture of uncertainty and unease. The question hung heavy in the air, a dark and unanswered riddle. He offered a few more words of consolation before taking his leave, leaving Susie alone in the studio, surrounded by the ghosts of happier times. Alone, Susie finally allowed her own grief to surface. She wept, not for herself, but for Arthur, for the unbearable pain he was enduring. She wept for the loss of her friend, for the terrible transformation that had taken place within Margaret. And she wept for the chilling mystery that surrounded it all, the unsettling suspicion that something far more sinister than a simple change of heart lay at the heart of Margaret's sudden marriage to Oliver Haddo. The ominous telegram, Haddo's calculated presence, Margaret's drastic change in behavior, it all pointed to a deeper, more disturbing truth. The hijinks Haddo had alluded to were not a celebration, but a cruel and calculated act of vengeance, a dark triumph over the man who had dared to challenge him. The seeds of a terrifying possibility had been planted, that Haddo's power extended far beyond mere influence, that he had somehow manipulated Margaret's very soul. And the thought chilled Susie to the bone. Chapter 11. Arthur returned to London, a changed man. Susie, unable to remain in the studio haunted by memories, traveled to Italy. Dr. Porhoët stayed in Paris, continuing his studies. Susie's journey through Tuscany and Umbria was punctuated by a brief, formal letter from Arthur detailing his busy life. Lectures, hospital appointments, growing practice, but omitting any mention of Margaret. The letter's coldness spoke volumes. In Rome, Susie learned the Haddos had been there, their eccentricities the subject of local gossip. They traveled lavishly, drawing attention with Haddo's flamboyant attire and Margaret's striking beauty and extravagant jewels. After a brief but impactful stay, marked by unpaid bills later settled, they abruptly departed for Monte Carlo. Susie, torn between dread and a desperate need to understand, followed them to Monte Carlo. The city's atmosphere of extravagance and moral ambiguity provided a fitting backdrop for the Haddos' increasingly bizarre behavior. They were known for their high-stakes gambling, extravagant parties, and outlandish appearances. Susie observed them at the casino. Margaret played under Haddo's constant direction, her expression disturbingly mirroring his own, a chilling reflection of his influence. Despite her continued beauty, a new, almost unsettling quality had crept into her demeanor. Susie overheard a disturbing conversation suggesting the Haddo's marriage was a sham, Haddo using Margaret as a mascot. This fueled her growing suspicion of something sinister at play. Margaret's style had also drastically changed, her once refined taste replaced by garish displays of wealth and questionable fashion choices. She even interacted amicably with a known courtesan, a shocking departure from her former behavior. Rumors surrounding the Haddos intensified, painting a picture of orgies, occult ceremonies, and Haddo's supposed magical powers. He was known as the Brother of the Shadow, a title both mocked and feared. Tales of his cruelty to animals, gambling indiscretions, drug use, and even rumored brutality towards Margaret circulated. Although Margaret outwardly seemed unaffected, these stories deeply troubled Susie. One particularly disturbing incident involved Haddo deliberately using a bad coin to pay a bill, causing a public scene that Margaret dismissed with unsettling indifference. This incident led to their social ostracization, and, mirroring their departure from Rome, they vanished again. Susie returned to London, drawn by a deep desire to see Arthur. Time and distance had allowed her to acknowledge her deep affection for him, accepting that his heart belonged elsewhere. Upon contacting him, she was invited to lunch at a public restaurant. The setting prevented any personal conversation, but Susie was shocked by Arthur's deteriorated state. He looked aged, worn, and deeply unhappy. The pain she had witnessed in Paris had become a permanent fixture on his face. He spoke of his relentless work schedule, using it as a shield against his grief. Susie attempted to offer comfort, inviting him to her rooms for a private conversation, but he refused, unable to face the pain of discussing Margaret. Susie then revealed that she had seen Margaret in Monte Carlo. This revelation led to a subsequent meeting at the opera, arranged at Susie's insistence, where Arthur's intense emotional reaction to the music revealed the depth of his suffering. After the opera, they encountered Arbuthnot, who invited them to a supper at the Savoy. This led to the devastating climax of the chapter, a face-to-face encounter with the Haddos. Arbuthnot, unaware of the past, introduced them, and Haddo seized the opportunity to create a deeply uncomfortable situation, even suggesting that Arthur and Margaret sit together. Haddo's grotesque joviality and Margaret's shocking behavior, including a vulgar anecdote, deeply distressed Arthur. The final, devastating confrontation occurred as they were leaving. Susie, overcome with anger and pity for Arthur, confronted Margaret, accusing her of destroying him. In a cruel twist, Margaret revealed that she knew Susie's long-held secret, her love for Arthur. This revelation, combined with the horrifying spectacle of Margaret's transformation and Haddo's manipulative cruelty, leaves Susie utterly shaken and adds another layer of complexity to the already tragic situation. The revelation hung in the air, a poisoned dart striking Susie's heart. Margaret's words, delivered with a chillingly detached amusement, echoed in her ears. "You're not going to deny that you've loved him passionately from the first day you saw him? Do you think I didn't see that you cared for him in Paris? You care for him now more than ever." Susie felt a wave of nausea, the blood draining from her face. Her carefully guarded secret, the silent, enduring love she had harbored for Arthur, had been exposed, not by her own confession, but by the very woman who had caused him so much pain. The irony was brutal, a cruel twist of the knife. She had spent years concealing her feelings, content to be a friend, a confidant, a silent witness to his happiness with Margaret. Now, that carefully constructed facade had been shattered, not in a moment of tender revelation, but in a bitter exchange fueled by spite and malice. She looked at Margaret, searching for some flicker of remorse, some indication that she understood the magnitude of her cruelty. But Margaret's face remained impassive, a mask of cold indifference. The transformation was complete. The kind, gentle girl Susie had known was gone, replaced by a stranger, a creature molded by Haddo's dark influence. Arthur, standing nearby, his gaze fixed on the floor, seemed oblivious to the exchange. He was lost in his own private torment, the vulgarity of Margaret's earlier story still echoing in his mind. He had barely registered the conversation between the two women, his focus entirely consumed by the crushing weight of his heartbreak. Susie, reeling from Margaret's revelation, could barely speak. The words caught in her throat, choked by a mixture of shame, anger, and a profound sense of loss. She had been stripped bare, her most vulnerable secret exposed to the harsh light of day. She had wanted to offer Arthur comfort, to ease his pain, but now she felt utterly powerless, her own heart a fractured mess. Margaret gave a small, bitter laugh and turned away, leaving Susie standing there, frozen in place, the weight of her unspoken love a heavy burden in the suddenly silent vestibule. The bustling crowd, the sounds of laughter and conversation, faded into a dull hum, as if the world itself had muted its vibrancy in recognition of her pain. The journey back to her lodgings was a blur. Susie sat in the cab, staring out at the passing streetlights, her mind replaying Margaret's words, each repetition a fresh wound. She had loved Arthur in secret, a quiet, unwavering devotion that had sustained her through years of watching him love another. Now, that secret had been weaponized, used against her in a moment of petty cruelty. When she finally reached her rooms, Susie collapsed onto her bed, exhaustion and despair washing over her in equal measure. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the images of Margaret's cold face, Arthur's tormented gaze, and the echo of Margaret's cruel laughter. But the memories persisted, swirling in her mind like a dark vortex. She thought of Arthur, his gentle nature, his unwavering kindness, his deep capacity for love. She remembered the joy she had felt when he was happy, the silent ache in her heart when he was sad. She had never dared to hope for more, content to be a part of his life, even on the periphery. Now, that small comfort had been taken from her. The knowledge that Margaret knew her secret created an insurmountable barrier between them, a wall of shame and embarrassment that she feared would never crumble. Susie also thought of Margaret, the friend she had lost, the woman who had transformed into a stranger. She tried to reconcile the image of the kind, sensitive girl she had known with the cold, calculating woman she had witnessed at the Savoy. But the two images refused to merge, leaving her with a chilling sense of bewilderment. What had happened to Margaret? What dark force had taken hold of her, twisting her into such a cruel and heartless creature? And then, Her thoughts turned to Haddo. His grotesque figure, his manipulative charm, his chillingly calculating gaze loomed large in her mind. She recalled the rumors, the whispers of occult practices, the tales of his cruelty. A shiver ran down her spine. There was something deeply unsettling about Haddo, something that defied explanation. Susie began to suspect that there was more to Margaret's transformation than a simple change of heart. She wondered if Haddo's influence extended beyond the realm of human understanding, if he had somehow exerted a supernatural control over Margaret, bending her will to his own dark purposes. The possibility, though terrifying, offered a glimmer of understanding, a way to reconcile the Margaret she had known with the woman she had become. It was a desperate hope, a fragile thread of reason, in a sea of confusion and despair. But as Susie lay there in the darkness, the chilling thought lingered. Perhaps Margaret was not a betrayer, but a victim, trapped in a web of darkness woven by a man whose power extended far beyond the ordinary. The thought was a chilling one, adding a layer of supernatural horror to the already tragic situation. Susie spent the next few days in a state of quiet turmoil. The revelation of her secret love for Arthur, coupled with the horrifying transformation of Margaret, had left her deeply shaken. She avoided social engagements, preferring the solitude of her rooms, where she could grapple with her turbulent emotions. She replayed the scene at the Savoy countless times in her mind, each time feeling a fresh wave of shame and despair. She thought of Arthur, his face etched with pain, his eyes filled with a deep, inconsolable sorrow. She longed to reach out to him, to offer him some comfort, but she was held back by the fear of her own exposed vulnerability. She worried that her presence would only serve as a painful reminder of his loss, a constant reminder of the woman he had loved and lost. She also wrestled with the image of Margaret, the friend she had cherished, now transformed into a stranger under Haddo's influence. The whispers of occult practices and dark rituals haunted her thoughts, fueling her suspicion that something far more sinister than a simple change of heart was at play. The idea that Margaret was not a willing participant in this tragedy, but rather a victim of Haddo's dark power, offered a chilling explanation for her transformation. As the days passed, Susie began to realize that she could not remain isolated forever. She knew that she had to find a way to move forward, to find some semblance of peace amidst the chaos. She decided that she would write to Arthur, a simple letter of friendship and support, carefully avoiding any mention of Margaret or the events at the Savoy. She hoped that a simple gesture of kindness would offer him some small measure of comfort. However, before she could put pen to paper, she received a letter of her own. It was from Dr. Porhoët, written in his precise, scholarly hand. The letter was brief, but contained a piece of information that sent a chill down Susie's spine. He wrote that he had made some inquiries into Haddo's background and had discovered a disturbing detail. Haddo had a history of manipulating and controlling women, often through methods that bordered on the hypnotic. He also hinted at Haddo's deep involvement in occult practices, suggesting that his influence extended beyond the realm of ordinary human interaction. The letter ended with a warning. Dr. Porhoët urged Susie to be cautious, to avoid any contact with Haddo, and to be wary of any information she received about Margaret. He expressed his deep concern for her safety, hinting at a danger that Susie could not fully comprehend. The letter left Susie deeply disturbed. It confirmed her worst fears about Haddo, painting him as a man capable of manipulating and controlling others through dark and mysterious means. The warning about Margaret filled her with a renewed sense of dread. Was Margaret truly in danger? Was she trapped in a web of Haddo's making, unable to escape his influence? Susie knew that she could not ignore Dr. Porhoët's warning. She felt a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need to do something to help Margaret, to protect Arthur from further pain. But she was unsure of what to do, how to intervene in a situation that seemed to be shrouded in darkness and mystery. As she pondered her next move, a new idea began to form in her mind. She thought of the rumors she had heard in Monte Carlo, the whispers of occult rituals and dark ceremonies. She wondered if there was any truth to these stories, if Haddo's power extended beyond the realm of human understanding. And then, a chilling thought struck her. Perhaps the key to understanding Margaret's transformation Perhaps the key to freeing her from Haddo's influence lay in uncovering the truth about his dark practices. This realization gave Susie a new sense of purpose. She decided that she would not remain passive any longer. She would investigate Haddo's background, delve into the rumors surrounding his occult activities, and uncover the truth about his relationship with Margaret. She knew it would be a dangerous undertaking, but she felt she had no other choice. She had to do everything in her power to protect those she cared about, even if it meant confronting the darkness that surrounded them. Chapter 12. Arthur spent days in agonizing uncertainty before a desperate idea took hold. He went to the Carlton, knowing Haddo was out, and requested to see Margaret. She was in her private room, neither reading nor working. "You told me I might call upon you," Arthur stated. Pale and silent, she offered no response. The usual social niceties felt impossible. "Why have you come?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "I thought I might be able to help you," he replied gravely. "I want no help. I'm perfectly happy. I have nothing to say to you." Her anxious glances at the door betrayed her words. "I feel we have much to say," Arthur insisted. "If here is inconvenient, will you see me elsewhere?" "He'd know," she cried, the words wrenched from her. "Do you think anything can be hidden from him?" Arthur was struck by the terror in her eyes, the drawn, pinched look of a cowed woman. "I want you to know I don't blame you," he said gently. "Nothing can lessen my affection for you." "Oh, why do you torture me?" she sobbed, pacing the room. "If you wanted me punished for the pain I've caused, you can triumph now." Susie said she hoped I'd suffer as you have. If she only knew. A hysterical laugh escaped her. She knelt before him, seizing his hands. "Did you think I didn't see? My heart bled for your wan face, your tortured eyes. You've changed so much, and it's my fault. Oh, Arthur, you must forgive and pity me." "There's nothing to forgive, darling," he cried. Her eyes hardened. "You say that, but you don't mean it. If you only knew, all I've endured is for you." She struggled for composure. "He never loved me," she explained. "He only wanted to wound you. He hated you, and he's made me this way so you'd suffer. It wasn't me who did this, but a devil within me." She recounted the day she had helped a seemingly dying Haddo in the studio, how he had gained a terrible power over her, making her like wax in his hands. She revealed his deception in getting Susie away that day, his cruel laughter at his own cleverness. A look of terror crossed her face. "Even now," she whispered, "he may be influencing me to say this, to cause you even greater suffering." "Vengeance for what?" Arthur asked. "For when you hit him, when you kicked him. He could have killed you, but he wanted this torture for us both." Her agitation was heartbreaking. Arthur tried to calm her, but she continued, describing the Sabbath he had taken her to, the horrors she had witnessed, and the chilling recognition of the landscape from that terrible afternoon. "He has awful powers," she insisted. "I've seen things beyond comprehension." A ghastly suspicion flashed through Arthur's mind. He feared she was losing her sanity. "You must leave him," he urged. "Come back to Susie. She'll help you." "I can't," she replied. "We're bound together." "But why? Come now. We're in London, surrounded by people. He can't touch you." "How do you know he isn't here now, listening?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "He has powers you don't understand. Those old legends, men turning into wolves." She then described a harrowing visit to a remote house, a place with barred windows and padded cells. It was an asylum. There she met a grotesquely obese woman, Haddo's mother, confined there for 25 years. The resemblance between them was appalling. Margaret continued, describing Haddo's long absences, his descent into depravity, his return from opium dens and encounters with vile women. "He's so cruel," she whispered. "He takes fiendish pleasure in suffering." Arthur, seeing her distress, poured her some whiskey. It calmed her somewhat. He took her to Susie's lodgings, where she fainted upon arrival. Susie, forgetting everything but Margaret's distress, readily agreed to care for her. For a week, Margaret remained weak and withdrawn. Arthur rented a cottage in Hampshire, hoping the peaceful surroundings would aid her recovery. While she physically improved, her spirit remained broken. She agreed to divorce Haddo, who made no attempt to contact her. This lack of response made Susie uneasy. 2 days after the divorce proceedings began, Haddo visited Arthur's consulting room. He admitted to sending the citation and mocked Arthur's marital rights. He then revealed his intention to file a counter-petition, naming Arthur as correspondent. "You infamous blackguard!" Arthur exclaimed. Haddo coolly countered that Margaret had left his hotel with Arthur and was now living under his protection. He threatened to ruin Arthur's career. Arthur, though furious, knew the case wouldn't be tried publicly, a fact Haddo conceded with a chilling smile before departing. As the trial neared, Margaret's demeanor shifted. Her earlier cheerfulness gave way to restlessness, silence, and a return of the fearful look in her eyes. She repeatedly said, "I'm afraid something is going to happen," without explanation. Susie, deeply worried, wrote to Arthur. The letter detailed Margaret's increasing agitation, her aimless wandering, and the return of her earlier terror. Susie admitted her own growing unease, her constant dread of Haddo. She longed for the trial to be over. The following morning, Susie found Margaret's room empty, a note on the pillow. "It's no good. I can't help myself. I've gone back to him. Don't trouble about me anymore. It's quite hopeless and useless. M." Arthur arrived soon after, having received a box of chocolates from Haddo with a taunting message. "I think the odd trick is mine." Susie showed him Margaret's note. "I'm afraid she's right," Arthur said. "He has some power over her we can't counteract." Susie agreed, convinced that Haddo could influence Margaret even from a distance. She believed Margaret's recent restlessness was due to this mysterious power, compelling her to return. "I can't blame her," Susie said. "She's a victim of a most lamentable fate. He cast a spell on her. What will happen now she's back in his hands?" Arthur cried, picturing Haddo's vengeful cruelty. "And yet there's nothing we can do. We can't go to the police and say a man cast a spell on his wife." "Then you believe it too?" Susie asked. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he replied. "But we can't do anything if she chooses to return. And I'm trapped in London." Susie then made a suggestion. "The only chance is to fight him with his own weapons. Would you mind if I went to Paris to consult Dr. Porhoët? He's learned in the occult. Perhaps he can help." Arthur, clinging to rationality, dismissed the idea as superstition. "Haddo's a scoundrel, a charlatan. He's worked on our nerves. He has no real power. Even after all you've seen?" Susie countered. "If my eyes show me what my training tells me is impossible, then my eyes deceive me." "Well," Susie declared, with a determined glint in her eye, "I shall run over to Paris." Chapter 13. Weeks passed. Dr. Porhoët, in his book-lined study overlooking the Seine, indulged in a nostalgic reverie of his native Brittany. Susie's arrival interrupted his melancholy. She had been in Paris for some time, forming a close friendship with the doctor, who admired her quiet strength and her unspoken love for Arthur. During Susie's visit, Dr. Porhoët excitedly revealed his discovery of an unknown manuscript by Paracelsus at the Arsenal Library. He mentioned a gruesome detail. Paracelsus fed his homunculi with human blood. This detail caused Susie to startle, a reaction noticed by the doctor. He then digressed into a discussion of the occult sciences and the history of the Arsenal, once the site of the Chamber Ardent, a tribunal for cases of sorcery and magic. He spoke of the allure of magic, the desire for love, revenge, and godlike power, but also the frequent consequences: disappointment, poverty, and death. Susie, deeply preoccupied with Margaret's situation, pressed him for more concrete opinions on the occult, but he remained cautious, emphasizing the need for patient, persistent investigation. Their conversation was interrupted by Arthur's unexpected arrival. He was visibly distressed, his movements nervous and uncharacteristic. "I've seen Margaret again," he announced. He struggled to speak, his words coming in a dull, bewildered fashion. He had gone to Susie's hotel, and upon learning she was out, instinctively knew he would find her with Dr. Porhoët. Dr. Porhoët, observing Arthur's cadaverous exhaustion and his profoundly altered demeanor, offered him coffee. He noted that the ordeal had robbed Arthur of his characteristic strength and certainty, leaving him unbalanced and neurotic. Arthur, after regaining some composure, explained his desperate journey. After Margaret's return to Haddo, Arthur had thrown himself into work, but a growing, irresistible feeling of foreboding consumed him. He was certain Margaret was in grave danger, though he couldn't explain why. Unable to bear the anxiety any longer, he had left London, feigning a need to attend to private business, and traveled to Vinning, near Skene. At the local inn, he posed as a prospective buyer of a nearby farm to explain his presence. He learned disturbing details about Haddo. He allowed no servants to sleep in the house, remaining alone with Margaret each night. The locals harbored a deep-seated fear of Haddo, attributing various misfortunes to his evil influence. They spoke of his quarrels, the sudden deaths and ruin that followed those who crossed him. They also mentioned Margaret's isolation, rarely seen outside the skiing grounds. Determined to see Margaret, Arthur ventured into the skiing park the following day. The landscape was desolate and oppressive, reflecting his inner turmoil. He found a broken fence and slipped into the neglected, overgrown grounds. After a long search, he found Margaret sitting on a stone bench. He called her name softly, then more loudly, but she didn't react. When he stood before her, she looked at him as if he were a stranger. Then, recognition dawned, and she became terribly agitated, believing him to be an apparition. "What are you doing here? Why won't you leave me alone?" she cried. Arthur explained his overwhelming fear for her safety. "For God's sake, go," she pleaded. "If he finds out you've been here." He was shocked by her appearance, pale, gaunt, with an unnatural glitter in her eyes. "What is the matter?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied, looking around anxiously. "Oh, why don't you go?" "I must do something," he insisted. "It's too late." "Nothing can help me now," she whispered, her voice like that of a corpse. "I've found out what he's going to do with me. He wants my life." Arthur cried out in dismay. "It's no use resisting," she continued. "I think I'll be glad when the moment comes. I'll at least cease to suffer." She then revealed that she had tried to resist Haddo's pull before, running away, but he had called her back, and she was powerless to resist. She explained that his plan would only work in very hot weather, suggesting a timeline. Arthur pleaded with her to leave with him, promising protection. "You don't love me anymore," she said. "You're only sorry for me. I'm not the Margaret you knew. I can never care for anyone but you," he insisted. "If you loved me, you'd go," she replied. "And take care. He'll never forgive you." She then started violently, as if hearing something, and urged him to flee. Before vanishing back into the woods, she recounted a horrific memory. A visit to Haddo's mother in an asylum, a place of padded cells and grotesque figures, where she saw an appalling likeness between the confined woman and Oliver. She also described Haddo's depraved behavior during his absences, his descent into opium dens, and association with criminals. After recounting this meeting to Susie and Dr. Porhoët, Arthur sought their advice. He revealed that he had confirmed Haddo's mother's confinement in an asylum and that the superintendent had expressed doubts about Haddo's own sanity. He asked if it was possible Haddo was planning a human sacrifice. "Nothing is more probable," Dr. Porhoët replied gravely. Susie recalled the Monte Carlo rumors about Haddo creating living beings through magic. Dr. Porhoët added that works on the black arts emphasized the importance of virginity for such rituals. Arthur, in despair, lamented their powerlessness to help Margaret. Dr. Porhoët mentioned the infamous Gillis de Rice as a historical example of human sacrifice. Susie, seeking to distract Arthur, suggested a trip to Chartres. Dr. Porhoët seconded the idea, and Arthur, exhausted and apathetic, agreed. The trip provided some temporary relief, and upon their return to Paris, Arthur thanked Susie for her kindness, believing he had regained his composure and dismissed his earlier fears as hysteria. He declared his intention to consult his lawyers and find a legal solution. However, their dinner at the Chien Noir was interrupted by Arthur's sudden, frantic reappearance. "Thank God! I found you!" he cried, his face contorted with fear. "Something awful has happened to Margaret." He explained that he didn't know how, but he felt it. Susie and Dr. Porhoët tried to reason with him, but he was unshakable in his conviction. I feel it in every bone of my body, he insisted. I couldn't be more certain if I saw Margaret lying dead in front of me. Susie, realizing the futility of argument, asked what he wanted them to do. I want you both to come to England with me at once, he pleaded. If we start now, we can catch the evening train. Susie, sensing the urgency of the situation, agreed, as did Dr. Porhoët. They rushed to the station, leaving everything behind. Arthur's frantic impatience and unwavering conviction that they were already too late hung heavy in the air. The train journey to England was a torment for Arthur. He paced the carriage restlessly, his mind consumed by visions of Margaret in danger. Susie and Dr. Porhoët watched him with growing concern, their own anxieties fueled by his palpable distress. Susie tried to reassure him, but her words felt hollow, even to her own ears. A heavy silence settled over them, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels and Arthur's restless movements. Upon arriving in London, Arthur insisted on going directly to Skene. He hired a car and drove through the night, the darkness mirroring the dread that filled his heart. Susie and Dr. Porhoët followed in a separate carriage, exhausted but equally determined. They arrived at Skene in the early hours of the morning. The house stood silent and imposing against the pre-dawn sky, a dark silhouette against the faint light. Arthur rushed to the main door and banged on it repeatedly, his urgency bordering on desperation. After a long, agonizing wait, the door was opened by a sleepy-eyed groundskeeper. Arthur brushed past him, ignoring his protests, and burst into the house. The interior was eerily quiet, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. He called out Margaret's name, his voice echoing through the empty halls. There was no response. Susie and Dr. Porhoët arrived shortly after, finding Arthur in a state of near panic. They joined him in searching the house, moving from room to room, their voices growing increasingly strained with each unanswered call. The house felt deserted, as if it had been abandoned long ago. Finally, they reached the upper floors, the air growing colder and heavier as they ascended. They found the attics, the rooms that the innkeeper had described as Haddo's domain. A faint, acrid smell hung in the air, and a dim light flickered from beneath a closed door. Arthur approached the door cautiously, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The scene that met their eyes was one of grotesque horror. The room was large and cluttered, filled with strange objects, alchemical equipment, arcane symbols drawn on the walls, and shelves stacked with ancient tomes. In the center of the room stood Haddo, his back to them, his massive form hunched over a table. As they entered, Haddo turned, his face contorted in a mask of rage and madness, his eyes, bloodshot and wild, fixed on Arthur with a look of pure hatred. And then they saw Margaret. She lay on the table, her body still and lifeless. Her face was pale and serene, as if she were asleep. But the sight of the deep wound on her chest, the bloodstains that soaked her white gown, told a different story. Arthur cried out in anguish, rushing towards Margaret. Haddo stepped forward, blocking his path. "You are too late, Burdon," he said, his voice low and menacing. "The experiment is complete." A struggle ensued, a desperate clash between Arthur's grief-fueled rage and Haddo's unnatural strength. Dr. Porhoët and Susie watched in horror, unable to intervene. The room became a scene of chaos, the strange objects scattered and broken as the two men fought. Suddenly, Haddo stumbled back, clutching his chest. He gasped for air, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. He fell to the floor with a heavy thud. Arthur, his breath ragged, his body trembling, rushed to Margaret's side. He cradled her lifeless form in his arms, his tears falling onto her pale face. Susie and Dr. Porhoët approached cautiously, their faces etched with grief and horror. Dr. Porhoët examined Haddo's body. He looked up at Arthur, his expression grave. "He is dead," he said quietly. "It appears his heart simply gave out." The room fell silent, the only sound the soft sobbing of Arthur as he held Margaret's body. The acrid smell in the air seemed to intensify, a lingering reminder of the dark ritual that had just taken place. Chapter 14. Susie never forgot the horror of their journey to England. The oppressive heat of London followed them north, making the crowded train unbearable. Arthur's anxiety grew with each passing mile, and Susie struggled to maintain a semblance of composure. Dr. Porhoët, exhausted from the sleepless night, sat silently, his face etched with worry. Upon arriving at Vinning, the heat persisted. Arthur, desperate for news, greeted the landlady with forced cheerfulness, then abruptly asked if anything had happened in his absence. "Of course you wouldn't have heard, sir," she replied gravely. Arthur trembled, barely controlling his voice. "Has the squire hanged himself?" he asked lightly. "No, sir, but the poor lady's dead." Arthur froze, his eyes widening with horror. "Poor thing," Susie managed to say. "Was it very sudden?" The landlady, oblivious to Arthur's distress, launched into a detailed account of Margaret's sudden death and burial that morning. "What did she die of?" Susie asked, watching Arthur anxiously. "They say it was heart disease," the landlady replied. "Poor thing. It's a happy release for her." Susie, fearing Arthur would faint, quickly ushered the landlady away and locked the door. She tried to comfort Arthur, telling him that if Margaret had died of heart disease, his suspicions were unfounded. He pushed her away violently. "For God's sake, speak to us," Susie pleaded. His silence was more terrifying than any outburst. Dr. Porhoët gently approached him. "Don't try to be brave, my friend. It's all right to show your grief. For heaven's sake, leave me alone," Arthur replied hoarsely. After a tense silence, Arthur abruptly asked the landlady how she knew Margaret had died of heart disease. "Dr. Richardson told me so." He then questioned her about Dr. Richardson's attendance on Margaret and his whereabouts. The landlady, confused by Arthur's interrogation, provided the information. After she left, Arthur, his face now set with grim determination, announced, "I'm going to see this doctor. Margaret's heart was as sound as mine." "What are you going to do?" Susie asked. "I'm going to put a rope around that man's neck," Arthur replied fiercely. "And if the law won't help me, by God, I'll kill him myself." Dr. Porhoët cried out in alarm, but Arthur silenced him, declaring that the time for grief was over. He was certain Margaret's death was not natural and would not rest until Haddo was punished. Susie insisted on accompanying him to Dr. Richardson's. The doctor, a man of about 55 with a white beard and a broad Staffordshire accent, greeted them with an air of self-importance. Arthur, in contrast, was abrupt and tense. Arthur explained his presence, stating his concern as Margaret's guardian and friend. Dr. Richardson, suspicious and resentful of London specialists, became defensive. Arthur directly asked about the cause of Margaret's death. "It was a very simple case of endocarditis," the doctor replied. Arthur pressed for details, asking how long before her death he had been called in. Dr. Richardson hesitated, reddened, and angrily refused to be cross-examined. Arthur persisted, asking how many times he had seen Margaret and whether there had been a post-mortem. Dr. Richardson dismissed the idea, citing the clear cause of death and the family's aversion to such procedures. Arthur then stated his dissatisfaction with the explanation, suggesting Margaret's death was not natural. Dr. Richardson angrily dismissed this as stuff and nonsense, asserting his 35 years of experience. Arthur, undeterred, threatened to seek an order for exhumation, suggesting it would be in Dr. Richardson's best interest to cooperate. Dr. Richardson vehemently refused, asserting his influence as chairman of the Board of Magistrates. He then abruptly ended the meeting. Outside, Dr. Porhoët cautioned Arthur against his unrealistic expectations of obtaining an exhumation order based on vague suspicions. Arthur, however, remained resolute in his determination to confront Haddo. Susie insisted on accompanying him. At the Skene Park gates, they encountered the lodgekeeper, who tried to prevent their entry. Arthur forced his way in, followed by Susie and Dr. Porhoët. They proceeded to the house, where they were met by another hostile servant. Suddenly, Haddo appeared. He had become grotesquely obese, his face swollen and distorted, his breath labored. His manner, however, retained its usual insolent urbanity. Arthur immediately accused Haddo of killing Margaret. Haddo remained unfazed. mocking Arthur's suspicions and suggesting he contact the police. He dismissed Margaret's earlier fears as a romantic temperament and cruelly rebuffed their presence. Arthur, after a moment of stunned silence, abruptly turned and left. Susie and Dr. Porhoët, feeling humiliated, followed him. Back at the inn, Susie asked Arthur what he planned to do next. After a long silence, he replied that he realized conventional methods were useless. He had only his own conviction of Margaret's violent death, which no one would heed. Susie suggested that perhaps Margaret had indeed died of natural causes. Arthur gave her a long, thoughtful look. "Perhaps there are means to decide that conclusively," he replied, as if to himself. He then announced his intention to take a walk alone. Susie, concerned, pleaded with him not to do anything rash. Upon his return late that night, Arthur immediately questioned Dr. Porhoët about an experiment he had once described, involving a boy who saw visions in a magic mirror. He then revealed a startling revelation. He was that boy. He described remembering the experience, the strange glow, the visions of unknown people performing actions, and the subsequent exhaustion. He then turned to Dr. Porhoët with a desperate plea. "I must see Margaret again. You have studied this science. Show her to me." Dr. Porhoët protested, claiming he had only studied the occult for amusement and had never practiced it. Arthur pressed him, asking if he believed it was possible. He recounted the story of Eliphaz Levi raising a spirit. Susie intervened, pleading with Arthur to let Margaret's soul rest in peace. Arthur explained that if her death was violent, her spirit might be earthbound. He insisted he needed certainty. "If she died a natural death, we shall have no power over her. But if her death was violent, perhaps her spirit is earthbound still. I tell you I must be certain. I want to see her once more, and afterwards I shall know what to do." Arthur then threatened to perform the ritual himself if Dr. Porhoët refused. Overwhelmed by Arthur's desperation and a sense of responsibility, Dr. Porhoët reluctantly agreed, warning of potential disappointment. Chapter 15. Arthur, eager to begin the invocation immediately, was persuaded by Dr. Porhoët to wait. They were exhausted from their journey, and the doctor insisted on gathering necessary materials. He also hoped that a night's rest would dissuade Arthur from his desperate plan. However, Arthur, remembering that the next day marked a week since Margaret's death, believed their spells might then be more potent. The following morning, it was clear none of them had slept. Dr. Porhoët gravely asked Arthur if he still intended to proceed. Arthur confirmed his resolve. The doctor then explained the need to fast throughout the day, a condition both Arthur and Susie readily accepted. Dr. Porhoët expressed his continued skepticism, but Arthur reminded him of his promise. The day passed slowly, the oppressive heat and brilliant sky adding to their unease. Arthur restlessly paced outside, oblivious to the burning sun. Susie tried to read, but her nerves were frayed, every small sound causing her to start. Dr. Porhoët spent the day in the parlor, desperately trying to recall the necessary rituals and incantations. As night fell and the stars emerged, Susie and Dr. Porhoët, faint from hunger, spoke in hushed tones, their apprehension growing with each passing hour. The village lights went out one by one, leaving them in an unnerving silence. Finally, Arthur appeared at the window. "Are you ready to come?" he asked. They gathered the necessary items and set out along the dark road to Skene. The desolate landscape loomed around them, the only sound their own footsteps. They were exhausted, barely able to walk. Susie requested a moment's rest, sitting on a roadside boulder. They waited patiently until she was ready to continue. They moved with a dreamlike stealth, as if guided by an unseen force. They reached the Skene gates. "Follow me closely," Arthur instructed. He led them along a narrow path beside the paling, the darkness making it nearly impossible to see. They stumbled through thick bracken and dense trees. Finally, Arthur stopped, pointing through an opening in the trees. They saw the house, all windows dark except those in the attics, which glowed with bright light. "Those are the attics he uses as a laboratory," Arthur whispered. "He's working now. There's no one else in the house." Susie was fascinated and terrified by the lights, imagining the horrific experiments Haddo conducted in secret. "There's no danger he'll come out," Arthur reassured them. "He remains there until daybreak." He led them deeper into the woods, back to the green space where he had last seen Margaret. The stone bench stood vaguely against the darkness. "This is where Margaret sat," Arthur said. "I can see to do nothing here," Dr. Porhoët replied. Arthur gave the doctor 2 brass bowls to serve as censers. While the doctor prepared, Arthur stood with Susie. The doctor moved back and forth, bending to the ground. Soon, the crackling of wood filled the air, and red flames shot up from the bowls, emitting heavy smoke and a strong, aromatic odor. The doctor's slight figure was sharply silhouetted against the flames. His face was etched with intense emotion, his doubts and fears seemingly forgotten. He resembled an ancient alchemist engaged in unnatural practices. Susie's heart pounded with fear. She reached for Arthur, who silently put his arm through hers. The doctor traced strange signs on the ground, invisible to Susie in the darkness. He added more twigs to the braziers, the flames once again cutting through the darkness. "Now come," he said. A sudden, overwhelming terror gripped Susie. Her hair stood on end. A cold sweat broke out on her body, and her limbs felt leaden. She was overcome by a paralyzing panic. "I can't. I'm afraid," she whispered hoarsely. "You must. Without you, we can do nothing," Arthur insisted. Susie, unable to reason, was consumed by fear. Arthur held her firmly. "Let me go," she pleaded. "I won't help you. I'm afraid." "You must," he repeated. "Why?" she cried, her fear turning into sudden anger. "Because you love me, and it's the only way to give me peace." A low wail escaped Susie's lips, her terror giving way to shame. Her secret was exposed. Then, anger returned, fueled by his apparent cruelty in using her love against her. She regained her composure and stepped forward. Dr. Porhoët instructed her where to stand, and Arthur took his place opposite her. "You must not move until I give you leave. If you go outside the figure I have drawn, I cannot protect you," the doctor warned. Dr. Porhoët stood in silence, then began to recite strange Latin words in a low, trembling voice. Susie barely heard him, unable to understand the meaning. The doctor's intonation, however, had lost its usual irony, replaced by an impressive gravity. Arthur stood motionless. The flames died down, leaving them visible only by the dim glow of the embers. Then, the necromancer spoke again, his voice now louder, uttering weird invocations in an unknown tongue. As he spoke, the embers suddenly went out, as if extinguished by invisible hands. The darkness became absolute. Susie strained her eyes but could see nothing, not even the stars above. Dr. Porhoët's voice, now strangely altered, seemed to emanate from the void. Susie clenched her hands to avoid fainting. Suddenly, a gust of wind broke the silence. The trees around them rocked and creaked, the leaves hissing in the sudden gale. The earth itself seemed to sway. Yet, where they stood, the air remained perfectly still. The contrast between the surrounding storm and the unnatural calm was terrifying. Then, Dr. Porhoët raised his voice, crying out in the unknown language with unprecedented sternness. He called Margaret's name 3 times. "Margaret, Margaret, Margaret." Instantly, the surrounding din ceased, replaced by complete silence. Then, with startling clarity, they heard the sound of a woman weeping. Susie's heart stopped. They recognized Margaret's voice. A groan of anguish escaped Arthur's lips, and he started forward, but Dr. Porhoët restrained him. The sobbing was heartrending, filled with despair and terror. And then, in the heavy darkness, Arthur saw her. She sat on the stone bench, just as he had last seen her. Her face was visible, her tears streaming down her cheeks, her body racked with sobs. Chapter 16. Arthur remained fixated on Vinning, unable to make any decisions. The events of their night in the Skene woods, the sound of Margaret's weeping, haunted them all. Arthur became increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours alone in the countryside, his activities unknown to Susie and Dr. Porhoët. Susie, deeply worried by his instability, feared he was capable of desperate actions. His hatred for Haddo had become an all-consuming obsession, pushing him towards violence. Several days passed. Susie and Dr. Porhoët decided to confront him. Late one night, as they sat by the open window of their inn's sitting room, the heavy, pre-storm air adding to their tension, Susie pleaded with Arthur to tell them his plans. "Arthur, you must tell us what you are going to do," she insisted. "It is useless to stay here. We are all so ill and nervous that we cannot consider anything rationally. We want you to come away with us tomorrow." "You can go if you choose," he replied. "I shall remain till that man is dead." Susie argued that staying would only worsen his state and that the law offered no recourse. She tried to glean some insight into his intentions. His grim reply confirmed her worst fears. "If I can do nothing else, I shall shoot him like a dog." A heavy silence followed. Arthur then asked them to leave, saying they were only hindering him. Susie refused, stating that she would stay as long as he did, fearing his actions would implicate her. Arthur looked at her steadily, and her resolute gaze caused him to turn away uneasily. The silence deepened, the oppressive atmosphere intensifying. Suddenly, a loud clap of thunder and a flash of lightning broke the tension. Susie welcomed the approaching storm, hoping it would alleviate Arthur's dark mood. Another thunderclap echoed overhead, and the wind rose, moaning through the trees. The lamp abruptly went out, plunging them into darkness. The suddenness of it startled them, as if someone had deliberately extinguished it. Susie's heart leaped. "There's someone in the room," she cried. Immediately, she heard Arthur lunge at an intruder. She instinctively knew it was Haddo, but how had he entered? And why? She tried to scream, but her voice failed. Dr. Porhoët remained frozen in his chair, silent and motionless. Susie sensed a deadly struggle unfolding in the darkness, a silent battle between two men consumed by hatred. She was paralyzed with fear. Arthur's heart exulted as he grappled with his enemy, vowing not to release him while he lived. He clenched his teeth, straining his muscles. Susie heard his labored breathing, but only his. The silent struggle continued, Arthur drawing strength from his burning desire for vengeance. Suddenly, he felt his opponent weaken, attempting to escape. Arthur tightened his grip, refusing to yield. With a tremendous effort, he threw his weight against Haddo, and they both fell heavily to the ground. Arthur, gasping for breath, knew he had to hold on. He pressed down on Haddo's arm, twisting it sharply until he heard a snap. The arm was broken. A low cry of triumph escaped Arthur's lips. Haddo panicked, struggling desperately to escape the crushing grip. Arthur seized his throat, his fingers digging into the rolls of fat, and threw his entire weight into the hold. He was strangling Haddo, determined to extinguish his life. He longed for light to witness the horror on Haddo's face, the fear in his staring eyes. He continued to press, the movements of his victim becoming convulsive, then weaker. Still, Arthur's hands remained clamped on Haddo's throat, his mind consumed by rage, hate, and sorrow. He thought of Margaret's suffering, her torment, wishing he could inflict countless deaths upon Haddo. Finally, all movement ceased. Haddo's body lay still. Arthur loosened his grip, feeling for a heartbeat. There was none. Haddo was dead. Arthur rose, straightening himself in the intense darkness. Susie, finally able to speak, cried out, "Arthur, what have you done?" "I've killed him," he replied hoarsely. "Oh God, what shall we do?" Susie cried. Arthur began to laugh hysterically, the sound terrifying in the darkness. "For God's sake, let us have some light." Susie pleaded. "I've found the matches," Dr. Porhoët said, as if awakening from a trance. He lit a match, then the lamp. They saw Arthur, his face ghastly, sweat pouring down his forehead, his eyes bloodshot, his body trembling. Dr. Porhoët held up the lamp, and they looked down at the floor, expecting to see Haddo's body. But there was no one there. Arthur recoiled in terrified surprise. Only the three of them were in the room. Susie felt the ground give way beneath her, a wave of nausea washing over her, and she fainted. When she regained consciousness, Arthur was holding her head. The memory of what had happened flooded back, and she burst into tears, clinging to him for comfort. "It's all right," he reassured her. "You need not be afraid." "Oh, what does it mean?" she sobbed. "You must pluck up courage. We're going now to skiing." Susie recoiled in fear. "No, I can't. I'm frightened. We must see what it means. We have no time to lose, or the morning will be upon us before we get back." Susie begged him not to go, fearing for his life. "There is no danger. I tell you the man is dead," Arthur insisted. "If anything happened to you," she began, unable to finish the sentence. "I will take no risks because of you," he said, his eyes fixed on her gravely. "I know that whether I live or die is not a matter of indifference to you." Susie blushed, a strange feeling stirring in her heart. "I will go with you wherever you choose," she said humbly. They stepped out into the night. The storm had passed, and the stars were shining. They walked quickly towards skiing, Arthur leading the way. The air was fresh and fragrant. They reached the park gates and then the spot from which they had previously viewed the house. As before, the attic windows shone with brilliant light. "There is no danger, I promise you," Arthur reassured Susie. "We are going to find out the meaning of all this mystery." He walked towards the house. Dr. Porhoët asked if he had a weapon. Arthur handed him a revolver. "Take this. It will reassure you, but you will have no need of it. I bought it the other day when I had other plans." Susie shuddered. They reached the portico. Arthur tried the handle, but the door was locked. "Will you wait here?" he said. "I can get through one of the windows, and I will let you in." He left them. Susie and Dr. Porhoët waited anxiously, dreading what they might find. Susie recalled the terrifying moment when they had expected to see Haddo's body but found nothing. "What do you think it meant?" she asked the doctor. "What is the explanation?" "Perhaps we shall see now," he replied. Arthur's absence stretched on, fueling Susie's fears. Finally, they heard footsteps inside, and the door opened. "I was convinced that nobody slept here, but I was obliged to make sure. I had some difficulty in getting in," Arthur explained. Susie hesitated to enter, terrified of what awaited them in the darkness. "I cannot see," she said. "I've brought a torch," Arthur replied, pressing a button to cast a beam of light onto the floor. Dr. Porhoët and Susie entered. Arthur closed the door and shone the torch around the large hall, its floor covered with lion skins. The walls were decorated with armor, swords, and weapons. An idea struck Arthur. He took down a large battle axe and swung it in his hand. "Now come." Silently, they entered the first room. The dim light revealed furniture covered in dust sheets, indicating it was in use. The rooms led into one another, and they walked through several, all with a desolate air. The oak paneling added to the somber atmosphere. They ascended the broad oak staircase. Arthur paused, running his hand over the polished wood. "It would burn like tinder," he remarked. They searched the rooms on the first floor, finding them equally empty and cheerless. They came to Margaret's room, noticing the dead flowers and her brushes still on the dressing table. It was a gloomy, uncomfortable space. Arthur stood there for a moment in silence. They continued to the second floor, which seemed to be the top of the main house. "How does one get up to the attics?" Arthur asked, looking around in surprise. He paused to think, then nodded. There must be some steps leading out of one of the rooms. They continued their search, but found no sign of a staircase. "What will you do if you can't find the way up?" Susie asked. "I shall find the way up," he replied resolutely. They returned to the staircase, still without success. "It's quite clear there is a way," Arthur said with impatience. "There must be something in the nature of a hidden door somewhere or other." He leaned against the balustrade and meditated. The light of his torch fell upon the opposite wall. "I feel certain it must be in one of the rooms at the end of the house. That seems the most natural place to put a means of ascent to the attics." They went back, and again he examined the paneling of a small room that had outside walls on 3 sides. It was the only room that did not lead into another. He ran his fingers carefully along the joins in the woodwork, pressing against each panel. Suddenly, he stopped. "Here it is," he exclaimed. He pressed hard on a particular spot, and a section of the paneling swung inward, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading upwards into darkness. A musty, stale air emanated from the opening. Arthur raised his torch, illuminating the steps. They were steep and worn, clearly not used regularly. "This is it," he said grimly. He took the battle axe in one hand and the torch in the other, and began to ascend. Susie and Dr. Porhoët followed close behind, their hearts pounding in their chests. The staircase was narrow and cramped, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. As they climbed, the light from the attic windows grew brighter, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Finally, they reached the top. The staircase opened into a large, cluttered room, the same room they had seen before, the scene of the horrific ritual. The air was still thick with the acrid smell, a chilling reminder of what had transpired there. The sight that greeted them was profoundly unsettling. The room was exactly as they had left it. The alchemical equipment, the arcane symbols, the ancient tomes, everything was in its place. But there was no sign of Haddo's body. Arthur moved further into the room, his torch beam sweeping across the scene. He stopped at the table where Margaret had lain. There was no blood stain, no sign that a body had been there at all. The table was clean, as if it had never been used. A cold dread washed over Susie. The disappearance of Haddo's body could be explained. Perhaps it had been moved. But the absence of any trace of Margaret, the complete erasure of the scene of her death, was inexplicable. It was as if the events of that night had never happened, as if they had been a terrible dream. Arthur lowered the battle axe, his hand trembling. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Where?" he stammered, unable to complete the question. Dr. Porhoët approached the table, examining it closely. He ran his fingers over the surface, then looked at Arthur, his face pale. "There is nothing," he said quietly. "It is as if it never occurred." Susie could no longer contain her fear. She felt a hysterical laugh rising in her throat. The reality of what they had witnessed, the struggle, the strangling, the sight of Margaret's lifeless body seemed to be dissolving, replaced by an even more terrifying uncertainty. "We saw him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We saw her. We were here. We." She trailed off, unable to articulate the impossible truth. Arthur turned to her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "I killed him," he said, his voice hoarse. "I felt his life leave him. He stopped, his gaze fixed on something behind them. Susie and Dr. Porhoët turned to see what had caught his attention. Standing in the doorway, his massive form filling the frame, was Oliver Haddo. He was alive. His face, though pale, bore no marks of the struggle. His eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Arthur with a chilling smile. A gasp escaped Susie's lips. Dr. Porhoët recoiled in horror. Arthur stood frozen, the battle axe slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. Haddo stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over them. "I see you have found your way up," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I trust you found everything to your liking?" He paused, his eyes lingering on Arthur. "I must confess," he continued, a hint of amusement in his voice, "I was rather surprised to find you gone when I awoke this morning. I had hoped for a more prolonged conversation." Arthur could only stare at him in disbelief, his mind reeling. He had felt Haddo's life extinguish beneath his hands. He had seen Margaret's lifeless body. How could this be? "How?" he managed to whisper. Haddo chuckled softly. "Ah, that is the question, isn't it? Perhaps," he said, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "You underestimated the extent of my resources." He took another step into the room, his presence filling the space with a palpable sense of menace. The mystery of Margaret's death, the terrifying events of the previous night, the disappearance of the bodies, all seemed to coalesce into a single, horrifying truth. They were facing something beyond human comprehension. The silence in the attic was thick with dread. Haddo's reappearance had shattered any semblance of reason or logic. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of the unnatural. Arthur, still reeling from the shock, found his voice. I killed you," he stammered, his words barely a whisper. "I felt your life leave you." Haddo's smile widened, revealing a hint of cruel amusement. "Did you indeed? Such a vivid imagination you have." Burdon. Perhaps you merely dreamt it." He gestured around the room with a languid wave of his hand. "As you can see, I am quite alive." Dr. Porhoët, his face ashen, finally found his voice. "But the body, Margaret," he stammered, unable to comprehend the scene before him. Haddo's eyes flickered towards the spot where Margaret had lain. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice dropping to a low, almost seductive tone. "Margaret, a necessary sacrifice, I'm afraid. A small price to pay for greater things." A chill ran down Susie's spine. The casual way Haddo spoke of Margaret's death, as if it were a minor inconvenience, was deeply disturbing. Arthur, his mind struggling to grasp the impossible, felt a surge of renewed anger. He lunged towards Haddo, his hands outstretched, intending to finish what he had started. But before he could reach him, Haddo raised a hand. It wasn't a gesture of defense, but rather a deliberate, almost theatrical movement. As he did so, a strange energy seemed to emanate from him, a visible ripple in the air. Arthur froze mid-stride, his body suddenly rigid, as if held in place by an invisible force. He strained against it, but he couldn't move an inch. "Such impetuosity," Haddo chided, his voice laced with mockery. "Really, Burdon, you must learn to control your baser instincts." He turned his attention to Dr. Porhoët, his eyes narrowing. "And you, Doctor," he said, his voice hardening, "I must confess, I am rather disappointed in you. I had hoped for a more discreet silence." Dr. Porhoët shrank back, his eyes wide with fear. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were facing something far beyond their understanding. Haddo turned back to Arthur, who was still struggling against the invisible force that held him captive. "You see, Burdon," he said, his voice now almost conversational, "you are a man of science. You believe in the tangible, the measurable, the provable. You dismiss what you cannot understand as superstition, as nonsense." He paused, a strange light flickering in his eyes. "But there are things, Burdon, that lie beyond the realm of your science. Things that exist in the shadows, in the spaces between what you perceive as reality." He took another step closer to Arthur, his presence radiating an almost palpable aura of power. "Things that you cannot comprehend," he whispered. He reached out and touched Arthur's forehead with a single finger. As he did so, Arthur's eyes widened in horror. He seemed to see something utterly terrifying, reflected in Haddo's gaze. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the invisible force released Arthur. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Haddo with a mixture of fear and revulsion, his mind reeling from what he had seen. Haddo turned away from Arthur, his gaze now fixed on the far wall of the attic. "I have shown you a glimpse," he said, his voice distant, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "A glimpse of what lies beyond. A glimpse of the power that I wield." He turned back to them, his expression now one of cold indifference. "Now," he said, his voice regaining its sharp edge, "I suggest you leave. This intrusion has become rather tedious." He gestured towards the staircase with a dismissive wave of his hand. Susie, her mind numb with fear, instinctively moved towards the stairs. Dr. Porhoët followed, his gaze fixed on Haddo, his face etched with terror. Arthur, however, remained rooted to the spot. He couldn't tear his gaze away from Haddo, his mind still struggling to process what he had seen, what he had felt. "Go, Burdon," Haddo said, his voice laced with impatience, "before I decide to change my mind." Arthur finally turned and followed Susie and Dr. Porhoët down the narrow staircase. As they descended, he could feel Haddo's eyes on his back, a chilling presence that lingered long after they had left the attic. They emerged from the house into the cool night air, the stars now seeming to mock their terror. They didn't speak as they walked back to the inn, each lost in their own thoughts, their minds struggling to comprehend the impossible events they had just witnessed. They had faced something beyond human understanding, something that defied all logic and reason. They had seen death defied, reality distorted, and the very laws of nature seemingly bent to the will of one man. And they knew, with a chilling certainty, that their ordeal was far from over. Thank you for joining me tonight on the Rainy Night Storyteller. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and captivating world of the magician. If you found this story enchanting, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who love a good tale, and subscribe to the channel for more Rainy Night stories. Your support means so much and helps keep the magic alive. Until we meet again, may your nights be peaceful and your dreams filled with wonder. See you in the next story. Good night and take care.